We're going to start with...
So before I pass to our speakers, let me just set the stage for the session. The starting point for any discussion of digitalization is the simple fact that property tax administration in many countries remains manually administered. And as we all know, manual administration of property taxes poses a wide variety of challenges related to data management, related to transparency, related to compliance by taxpayers, and related to the risks related to collusion, corruption, and so forth. And so against that background, we know that the digitalization of property administration holds enormous potential for improving outcomes. And let me just very briefly mention some of those potentials to help frame what we're doing here. We've seen the ways in which the use of technology can assist in the creation of comprehensive maps of properties using GIS tools. We heard yesterday about the ways technology can be used to put in place automated valuation methodologies to simplify valuation. We know about the ways in which technology can assist with data management. The property tax, we all say, is a data-hungry tax. Technology can help to manage that data. Technology can make systems more robust and resistant to problems, right? Through audit logs that track changes in the data that's held in IT systems, we can better regulate things like collusion or corruption or simple administrative error. IT can assist with simple and transparent billing to taxpayers, and more broadly with making systems transparent to taxpayers by allowing them to easily access information about their properties, about their tax liabilities. At the extreme, technology can allow for property tax registers and valuation registers to be available online, where taxpayers can access them freely. And of course, technology can help with facilitating compliance by making it easier for taxpayers to access their bills, but also to pay their bills. But despite that potential, and this is the real key to this session, we know that all of that potential is rarely fully realized in practice. And so let me say at a high level a couple of words about why that is, before then getting into the detail with our speakers. When I think about this question, I think about sort of four kinds of reasons why IT systems don't deliver on their promise. One is the simple inadequacy of systems themselves. Some systems are badly built, they have bugs, they don't have the functionality that governments need. Governments sometimes end up with those systems because of flawed procurement processes, or IT firms selling them systems that don't live up to what was promised in practice. A second kind of problem are systems that work, but are so excessively complex or costly that they're difficult to use and difficult to sustain. As we've talked about already, the best IT system is not necessarily the fanciest IT system. It's the system that does what is needed, is user-friendly to those who need to use it, and which is cost-effective enough that it can be sustained over time. But that's not often the case. A third is other problems of sustainability. You've built a good system, it's working well, but over time, changes are needed. The person who built the system isn't available to provide that support in making changes, and the system progressively has increasing problems. We know that this is a problem that many governments encounter. And finally, we can think about the political and administrative challenges of IT. Sometimes the challenge of IT isn't so much about the system itself, but about persuading administrators, politicians to adopt the system and to use it effectively. Because we know that sometimes there's resistance to bringing in new tools. So technology reform is also about navigating those challenges. So against that background, this session will explore two big questions in this opening statement. First, why do we see such disappointing outcomes in many cases, despite the obvious potential of IT-driven reform? And second, what are some key opportunities and key strategies that can be used to improve outcomes when trying to digitalize property tax administration? So as with yesterday, we're going to allow each of our speakers 5 minutes to make their opening statements. After that, I'll then come back and ask questions of each of our speakers, 2 rounds of questions, each with them responding for 3 to 5 minutes again. And then we'll hope to have lots of time to open to the floor to invite your questions, but also perhaps some brief sharing of experiences navigating these problems. So with that, let me just look to the floor to see. Okay, so we're still waiting to solve the technical question for Morphal online. So I think I'm going to begin then with you, Xavier. So you can kick us off. Over to you.
Hello. Yeah. Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for the introduction, Will. You've already stole quite a lot of thunder of what I was going to say, but it's good to see. It's good to see that we agree on many points. So many governments and government partners I've interacted with in the past and currently, they have a similar story to tell. They collaborated with an international or national partner to develop an IT system for property tax administration, but eventually this system reached a point where it stopped working, became unusable, and thus reform effectively failed. The reasons that led to an IT system becoming unusable can broadly be categorized into the following set. IT infrastructure fails, high maintenance costs, software issues like bugs or other limitations within the software, the non-user friendliness and complexity of the underlying approach, lack or inexistence of continuous support for implementing partners, or political resistance. And so this is the repetition that Will was mentioning. The IT system becoming unusable can bring many frustrations to reform-willing governments. They become unable to administer the tax cycle, unable to attend to queries and appeals from taxpayers, and most importantly, they cannot continue to collect revenue. So they are faced with a decision to either revert to an old, potentially manual system, or search for a new functional and sustainable IT solution to take another stab at the reform. It is fair to assume that reverting to the manual system is not the preference, as presumably the desire to implement an IT system stems from the desire for effective tax administration through technology. And from my experience with IT systems, I have found that there are a variety of technical considerations implementers want to make. First, the mechanisms to avoid vendor lock-in need to be put in place. The system should be interoperable with third-party applications. The software should be simple, user-friendly, and highly configurable so that it can be tailored to the local context. And last but not least, the system should be affordable to maintain, hardware and software equally. If set up carefully, IT-led reforms have significantly increased likelihood of success, or in the worst case, failure is not so dramatic. Regardless of how perfect the system may be, it is furthermore crucial that it is accompanied by a holistic approach to reform. Some of the most important components to holistic reform are the underlying taxation model, stakeholder engagement and sensitization, and capacity building, to name a few. From a conceptual point of view, reducing the complexity of the underlying taxation mechanisms, such as, for example, the valuation approach, has, in my experience, been an efficient enabler of reform. So the data that needs to be collected for a computer-assisted mass appraisal should be very easy to collect. The way that fees and taxes are calculated should be transparent, as this facilitates ultimately the understanding of taxpayers and government staff equally, and thus increases their buy-in into the reform and may ultimately lead to higher compliance rates as well. From a political point of view, it is recommendable to engage the stakeholders early in the process to gather support. These stakeholders may range from central government officials, relevant heads of departments within the local government, or influential taxpayers. The broader the engagement at the outset of the reform, the more likely it is that the relevant stakeholders are going to provide support throughout the process, and implementers are going to encounter less resistance. Adding continuous, comprehensive, and intensive sensitization campaigns on all aspects surrounding the property taxes should further foster a positive outcome. The complexity of overhauling an entire system cannot be underestimated. Focusing on processes surrounding the IT systems, such as continuous property discovery, effective tax bill delivery, secure revenue collection methods, and auditing the system require intensive training and support in order to build sustainable capacity within the government to run the administration of the financial year with support of an IT system. So to summarize, I see my time's up, a variety of mechanisms can be put in place to avoid IT systems becoming a liability rather than an enabler of reform. All efforts to build a sustainable IT system are, however, likely to be in vain as long as there is no holistic approach to the implementation of the system and thus of every aspect of property tax reform. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Saver. Alors maintenant, je vais changer en français, car nous pouvons nous préparer. OK. Je pense que tout le monde est prêt. Alors, nous avons encore des petites difficultés avec la technologie. Alors, on va commencer avec toi, Géraud, et puis après, on va avoir Mort.
Je vous entends, je ne sais
Je
pas
vais
si vous
passer
m'entendez.
Géraud Tossou du Bénin, qui va nous expliquer ses réflexions sur les défis et les possibilités sur la réforme du technologie. Géraud.
Ok, merci. C'est un plaisir pour moi de prendre la parole devant toute cette frange de personnes qui s'intéressent aux questions liées à la gestion de l'impôt foncier, notamment aux réformes. Mes prédécesseurs viennent de se prononcer sur les différents défis que les États et les administrations fiscales doivent relever pour améliorer la gestion de l'impôt foncier. Conscient de ces défis, la Direction générale des impôts du Bénin a trouvé des réponses à ces différents défis. Et pour en parler, je voudrais que vous reteniez 3 dates, 3 années. 1991, 2013 et 2017. En 1991, grâce à la coopération française, nous avons pu mettre en place ce que nous appelons le registre foncier urbain. Grâce à cette réforme, des photos aériennes, des vues aériennes ont été prises au niveau des 3 villes principales du pays. Ces vues aériennes ont permis de mettre en place une cartographie que nous appelons plan parcellaire. Dès lors, nous avons pu avoir en base de données toutes les parcelles qui sont sur le territoire de ces 3 villes, avec les bâtiments, leurs caractéristiques y comprises. Nous venons ainsi d'identifier les propriétés foncières. La seconde étape, c'est de pouvoir rattacher les propriétaires à ces propriétés foncières. Des enquêtes fiscales ont été organisées régulièrement. Des équipes ont été envoyées sur le terrain pour pouvoir collecter des informations sur les propriétaires. Une fois revenu au bureau, la connexion ou bien le lien entre les propriétés foncières et les propriétaires les liens ont été établis. Et dès lors, l'administration fiscale était en mesure de pouvoir faire les émissions concernant les impôts fonciers et aller placer les avis concernant les propriétaires. L'informatisation a connu ainsi ses débuts en ce qui concerne la gestion de l'impôt foncier. Les émissions sont informatisées, de même que le recouvrement. Pour les paiements, nous n'avons pas encore réussi à faire payer en ligne les propriétaires fonciers. La deuxième date, 2013, s'inspirant du succès de la réforme qui a été faite au niveau des villes à statut particulier, les 3 villes, je vais parler, les villes secondaires ont connu également une réforme qui a consisté à mettre en place un système d'information foncière, qui est une version allégée du RFU, Régime foncier urbain, et ce qui a permis d'avoir quelques plans parcellaires et a permis de construire aussi une base de données foncière pour pouvoir en faciliter la gestion informatique, tant au niveau des émissions qu'au niveau du recouvrement. La troisième date et dernière date dont j'ai envie de vous parler, c'est 2017. En 2017, nous avons commencé la réforme de mise en place d'un cadastre. Comme vous le savez, certains intervenants l'ont dit hier, le processus de mise en place d'un cadastre, c'est un processus qui est long et qui prend beaucoup de temps. Nous sommes dans la dynamique et je pense qu'avec ce cadastre, nous allons pouvoir mieux organiser la gestion de l'impôt foncier, les problèmes d'identification des propriétés foncières et des propriétés seront mieux gérés. Toutes ces réformes ont permis à la Direction générale des impôts du Bénin de pouvoir accroître les émissions et les recouvrements. Nous avons noté que nos performances se sont nettement améliorées au niveau des impôts fonciers. Donc voilà quelques éléments que je voudrais partager avec vous en ce qui concerne la réponse de l'administration fiscale du Bénin face aux différents défis dont nous parlons depuis hier. Merci.
Merci beaucoup, Jérôme. Ça semble un bon projet. Dans la prochaine question, je vais te demander un peu de nous décrire aussi les difficultés, disons, parce que c'est sûr que ce n'était pas simple. Alors maintenant, je pense qu'on va passer à Morphal. Mor, est-ce qu'on te sent ici?
Oui, je vous entends. Je ne sais pas si vous m'entendez par contre. Vous m'entendez?
OK. Est-ce que tu es là-bas, Mor?
Oui, je vous entends. Bonjour, je vous entends très bien. Je ne sais pas si vous m'entendez. Colette, je vous entends très bien. Oui, je suis en train de parler, mais apparemment, c'est vous qui ne m'entendez pas. Mais je vous entends très bien. Je suis depuis le début.
OK. Ça semble qu'il il nous écoute, mais on ne peut pas le sentir. Alors, un moment de plus, sinon on va aller avant.
Vous m'entendez?
OK. 30 secondes, moment de pause. Nous essayons de le rejoindre.
Oui, Colette. Oui. Vous m'entendez? Vous m'entendez là? Est-ce que vous m'entendez?
Peut-être je continue avec celles qui sont là. Okay. I think what we'll do is while we try to sort out the technology problem, we'll continue with the speakers we have here on stage. So let me begin with questions to the panelists we have here, and we'll hope that we can get connected here. So I'm going to begin with you, Xaver. You mentioned among the different challenges that you described around IT-led reforms, this problem of vendor lock-in, right? The idea that governments have secured a system from a particular IT vendor, but then when they need support in managing that system over time, that support may not arrive. So I was wondering if you could say a bit more, not just about the problem, but about possible solutions and strategies for avoiding vendor lock-in. Because I know that for many in the room, this has been a challenge with experiences of adopting new technologies. Over to you.
Indeed, thank you. So besides the lack of support provision throughout or beyond the implementation, vendor lock-in goes further. Vendor lock-in basically means that or without facing major difficulties. These difficulties may be of financial nature, or they may be that the data within the system cannot be extracted or migrated to a different software. And so there are a number of mechanisms that can be put in place to avoid such a scenario. And maybe the first thing to do is to set up a proper service level agreement. In a service level agreement, on one hand, support is, it is established how support is going to be provided throughout the use of the software. But it also clarifies any costs associated to further development, so that developers or IT system providers may not increase the price of adding a module or adding some configurability to the system to the extent that the government cannot afford it anymore. Another thing that needs to be, or another mechanism that needs to be put in place is clarifying data ownership. Who owns and what happens if there's anything leading to, well, to the system becoming unusable or the government wanting to back out of the system. So there needs to be a clear exit strategy besides making clear who owns the data. Furthermore, the vendor lock-in in that sense also goes beyond the software itself by making sure that the hardware the software is hosted on can easily be replaced within the local context where it's being used. So for example, with the people from Kananga that we're working together at the moment, they told me that they had implemented a system some time ago with a company from, or with an international partner. And then servers started breaking down, computers stopped working, some of the components of the IT hardware stopped working, and there was no way to import these goods into the Congo and have them replaced. And so making sure that you use software that, or hardware that can be replaced locally or can be procured locally, on top of making sure that it is fairly recent and so it doesn't need to be replaced very frequently, can already help to avoid vendor lock-in.
Great. Thank you very much, Xaver. And I think just to get everyone thinking about this, when we get to the comments and discussion, I know there are others in the room who have had similar problems. So I think it'd be very interesting to hear from those who have struggled with this dynamic, and also hearing about strategies to address it. So I think we're going to try again now to get Morphal. Alors je vais changer en français.
Je vous entends très bien.
On va essayer une deuxième fois. Si ça ne fonctionne pas, nous avons une vidéo qui nous a envoyé et on va utiliser le vidéo en place. Ok. Je le passe à Morphal.
Bonjour à tous, vous m'entendez?
Encore une fois, mort.
Oui, vous m'entendez?
Oui, parfait.
Ok, bonjour à tout le monde. Et désolé pour tous ces soucis techniques. Désolé également de ne pas pu être présent avec vous. J'aurais bien aimé le faire. Je vais aller très vite, vu qu'on a perdu un peu de temps avec les problèmes techniques. Donc, moi, je vais moins faire focus sur l'aspect technologique. Je crois que ceux qui m'ont précédé ont déjà,
Non, je ne pense pas
j'imagine,
que ça fonctionne.
vous ne m'entendez pas?
2 minutes. Je vous dis quand.
OK. Je vais continuer en français. OK, je vais continuer en français. C'est dommage, mais nous avons des problèmes avec le son, non avec la connexion. Ma-
Vous m'entendez là?
Attendez, est-ce qu'on peut bouger le... Can we move the video from behind the speaker? If it's not working, we want to allow us to focus on the speakers, please. OK. Géraud, je pense que je vais passer à toi. Alors, comme j'avais dit avant, tu as décrit un programme de réforme qui s'assemble à vu des grands succès. Maintenant, je voulais savoir si tu pouvais partager avec nous quelles sont les stratégies clés que vous avez mises en place pour assurer un succès dans l'utilisation des TI par l'impôt foncière. Merci beaucoup.
Merci. En termes de stratégie, d'abord, il faudrait convaincre les propriétaires fonciers de l'intérêt qu'ils ont à utiliser la technologie pour pouvoir avoir accès à l'information relative à l'imposition de leurs biens fonciers et également leur donner la possibilité de payer les taxes foncières qui sont liées à ces biens. Une fois que les propriétaires fonciers sont convaincus de l'utilité de ces facilités que l'administration fiscale leur offre, ils sont enclins à collaborer avec les structures de l'État ou bien les structures locales pour que les différentes réformes qui sont prévues puissent facilement bouger. En ce qui concerne la direction générale des impôts, nous avons revu le mode de calcul de l'impôt foncier. Et je voudrais rappeler que dans le cadre de la réforme du registre foncier urbain, pour la détermination de la valeur locative, c'est une expertise immobilière qui avait été réalisée en 1998. Mais regardez le temps, 98 à aujourd'hui, l'écart qui a entre cette année et la date d'aujourd'hui. Il est important que cette évaluation financière soit revue pour pouvoir permettre de se coller à la réalité. Donc la réflexion a été de revoir le mode de calcul de l'impôt foncier, de le rendre plus simple afin que le propriétaire foncier lui-même puisse être en mesure de calculer son impôt avec des outils très simples. L'autre réflexion, c'est de pouvoir permettre le paiement de ces impôts fonciers par téléphonie mobile, par virement bancaire. Donc, c'est un projet sur lequel nous sommes très avancés et je pense qu'au début de l'année 2024, la possibilité sera donnée aux propriétaires fonciers des 3 villes à statut particulier de pouvoir payer leurs impôts en ligne par les moyens modernes.
105 minutes,
Donc,
105 minutes si ça ne marche pas.
c'est autant de choses sur lesquelles nous travaillons pour pouvoir rester conforme aux bonnes pratiques qui ont cours dans la gestion des impôts fonciers. Et ces défis, nous nous rendons compte à l'occasion de cet atelier, de cette conférence, que ces défis sont partagés par tous les pays et c'est le lieu d'échanger, de partager nos expériences pour profiter de ce que les autres ont mieux réussi et de prendre également connaissance des points sur lesquels ils ont des difficultés et de ne pas faire les mêmes. Donc voilà ce que je pourrais dire concernant cette. Merci.
Merci beaucoup, Géo. Tu m'avais dit qu'on... Toi, non, on ne le fait pas. OK. We're almost there. Let's give it a minute here. I think we're close. No. Okay, pause. Okay, I think we've got it. Apologies, everyone. Thanks for your patience. Xavier was pointing out it's ironic that in our session about IT, we can't get the IT to work. Maybe there's a lesson in this about the difficulty of IT-driven reform. That said, let me just introduce then again. As I said, Morphal was meant to be here with us. He was unable to travel because of some of the challenges going on in Senegal at the moment. But we really wanted him to be able to share his experiences. So in case of the risk of Zoom not working, we've instead asked him to record a video where he's sharing his thoughts. The video is a bit longer, so we're just going to do it as a single video to avoid complicating things further. So he will sort of present via video for about 12 minutes. I'll then ask a couple of last questions to our panelists, and we should still have then about a half an hour for discussion with the broader group. So I think we can begin the video now. Thanks, everyone.
présenter quelques éléments de contexte qui permettent un peu de situer l'importance que nous avons aujourd'hui à suivre ces initiatives-là. Comme dans la majeure partie des systèmes fiscaux, nous avons au Sénégal des impôts, dont l'élément d'imposition est le foncier, qu'il s'agisse d'un terrain nu, ou qu'il s'agisse d'un terrain sur lequel est bâti, est édifié des bâtiments à usage d'habitation, à usage industriel ou tout autre usage. Aujourd'hui au Sénégal, les études, les estimations que nous faisons nous disent que le potentiel fiscal en matière d'impôts fonciers n'est exploité qu'à hauteur de 7%. Donc aujourd'hui, le Sénégal n'exploite pas plus de 7% de tout ce qu'il peut tirer comme revenu qui a comme élément d'imposition le foncier. On note également élément important que nous présentons pour faire un peu de situer le contexte sénégalais. L'agence qui est en charge du recensement au Sénégal, que nous appelons l'Agence nationale de la statistique et de la démographie, avait effectué en 2014 un recensement général de l'habitat. Qu'au moins 1 500 000 unités existaient au Sénégal. Des unités entendues dans le sens de bâtiments construits en dur. Donc on a développé au moins 1 500 000. Donc ce nombre n'inclut pas les terrains nus, n'inclut pas non plus tout ce qui est construction légère pour lesquelles le potentiel fiscal peut être sans intérêt. Donc c'est 1 500 000 de bâtiments pour lesquels on a un potentiel fiscal ou on a un intérêt à l'imposer à l'impôt foncier. Mais figurez-vous que sur ce potentiel-là, les rôles d'impôt ne concernent en réalité qu'environ 200 000 unités. Donc vous voyez un peu le gap énorme qu'il y a eu entre le potentiel et ce que nous exploitons aujourd'hui. L'une des raisons qui explique cela, c'est un peu les modes de gestion de l'impôt foncier que nous avons hérité de l'ancien système et pour lesquels nous n'avons pas encore terminé de faire l'évolution. Donc ça m'amène à parler un peu de comment l'impôt foncier est administré au Sénégal. On imagine que c'est le cas de beaucoup de pays africains également. Il y a 3 administrations qui interviennent dans la chaîne de traitement de l'impôt foncier. Il y a d'abord l'administration fiscale, la direction des impôts, qui assure tout ce qui est collecte de l'information, tout ce qui est calcul de l'impôt, tout ce qui est opération de recensement. Il y a de l'autre côté une autre direction, la direction du Trésor public, la direction de la comptabilité publique, le Trésor donc public, qui assure le recouvrement de ces impôts locaux-là. Mais il y a le 3e acteur qui est la collectivité territoriale. Parce que j'imagine que ça peut être le cas d'autres pays. L'impôt assis sur le foncier, la plupart des recettes recouvrées à ce titre-là est destiné aux collectivités qui abritent l'immeuble ou le bâtiment qui fait l'objet de l'impôt. Donc c'est ce qu'on appelle au Sénégal un impôt local, donc affecté à une collectivité locale, qu'on oppose un peu aux autres impositions que nous appelons impôts d'État, tels que la TVA, l'impôt sur le revenu, l'impôt sur les sociétés. Donc ce sont ces 3 acteurs-là qui interviennent dans la chaîne de traitement de l'impôt foncier. La direction générale des impôts, la direction générale du Trésor public et les collectivités territoriales. Ça, c'est un premier élément important à noter. Le deuxième élément, c'est un peu les modes de calcul et de perception de l'impôt. Dans la plupart des systèmes fiscaux, les impôts fonciers sont des impôts, encore les plus anciens impôts, qui datent de décennies, voire de siècles. Et aujourd'hui, notre administration, en tout cas, n'a pas pu faire totalement la refonte de ce système de taxation du revenu foncier. Donc les méthodes de gestion, les méthodes de collecte de l'impôt, les méthodes de distribution des avis d'imposition aux titulaires de ces immeubles-là qui doivent payer, et les méthodes de recouvrement ne sont pas modernisées. Donc ce qui fait qu'aujourd'hui, on a du mal à appréhender tout le potentiel fiscal que nous avons estimé en matière d'impôts fonciers. Donc face à ces situations-là, beaucoup d'initiatives ont été prises pour améliorer l'efficacité des services dans ce domaine et donc nous essayons de nous rapprocher au maximum de ce potentiel fiscal. Parmi les axes d'amélioration, il y a bien entendu l'aspect législatif et réglementaire. Donc changer les textes qui organisent ces impôts-là, mais il y a surtout l'aspect administration de cet impôt-là. C'est dans ce cadre-là que nous avons initié il y a 3 ou 4 ans maintenant un projet qui vise à digitaliser toute la chaîne de traitement de l'impôt foncier. De la collecte de l'impôt, donc du recensement, jusqu'au paiement de l'impôt par le titulaire de l'immeuble ou du terrain nu et sa comptabilisation. C'est un projet sur lequel nous travaillons depuis bientôt 5 ans et pour laquelle la partie qui est aujourd'hui achevée, c'est la partie collecte de l'impôt sur le foncier. Aujourd'hui, nous avons développé une application qui digitalise tout le processus de paiement. Et nous avons également mis en place des outils, un questionnaire intégré à cette application-là, qui permet aux agents de terrain de collecter l'information sur le foncier et de pouvoir et de relever également toutes les caractéristiques, toutes les données pertinentes pour pouvoir assurer plus tard l'imposition. Et la collecte d'informations donc, se fait par des agents de terrain au moyen de tablettes qui sont elles-mêmes connectées à l'application directement. Une autre évolution qu'on a notée au Sénégal à partir de 2012, on a créé un identifiant attaché à la matière imposable, au bien imposable, au bâtiment ou au terre. Dans tous les systèmes d'administration, la question de l'identifiant est une question importante. Donc, tout contribuable a un identifiant, au Sénégal qu'on appelle le numéro d'identification nationale des entreprises et associations, qui a une autre appellation numéro d'identification fiscale dans d'autres pays. Mais en plus de cela, puisque les impôts fonciers portent exclusivement sur la matière foncière, sur le terrain ou sur le l'immeuble, nous avons également institué un identifiant unique de l'immeuble, une sorte de numéro d'identité qui suit l'immeuble durant toute sa vie, quelles que soient les évolutions sur la contenance, sur les propriétaires même. L'identifiant attaché à l'immeuble est fixe. On appelle le numéro d'identification cadastrale. Ce numéro est délivré par l'administration des cadastres. Donc aujourd'hui, le système digitalisé que nous avons mis en place pour gérer la question de l'amélioration de la gestion foncière des impôts fonciers part de cet identifiant cadastral. Donc l'agent de terrain, l'agent qui doit faire l'opération de recensement, se voit affecter un certain nombre d'immeubles qu'il doit recenser à partir d'une application. Et sur sa tablette, l'application géolocalise le bien et il va sur place, il collecte toutes les informations qui permettent plus tard à l'administration d'évaluer le bien, d'évaluer sa valeur imposable et de pouvoir calculer l'impôt. Mais je dois dire que cette initiative, si elle a marché sur le côté collecte de l'impôt, n'est pas encore totalement aboutie. Je disais au début qu'il y a 3 acteurs qui interviennent dans la chaîne foncière. Il y a l'administration des impôts, qui collecte l'impôt, qui calcule. Mais il y a aussi l'administration du trésor public et il y a les collectivités locales qui assurent d'autres tâches. Donc aujourd'hui, la partie recouvrement, la partie traitement au niveau du trésor public et la partie traitement au niveau de la collectivité locale, aujourd'hui n'est pas encore effectivement digitalisée. Même si dans la conception de l'application que nous utilisons depuis 3 ou 4 ans maintenant, tous ces modules-là sont prévus, mais nous n'avons pas encore pu établir une collaboration qui puisse, avec l'administration du Trésor, avec les collectivités rurales, assurer une digitalisation intégrale de la gestion de l'impôt foncier, de la collecte de l'information vers le paiement de l'impôt. Au-delà du premier aspect, qui a un peu retardé la mise en œuvre du projet, nous avons également noté d'autres obstacles que je souhaiterais partager avec vous. Le premier obstacle que je vais citer, c'est un peu tout ce qui est lié à la résistance au changement. Comme vous tous vous le savez, quand on introduit de nouvelles méthodes de travail, de nouvelles façons de faire, il y a des résistances soit actives ou passives de la part des agents qui doivent adopter ces nouvelles méthodes de travail. Et comme je le disais, dans la plupart des administrations, les impôts fonciers sont de vieux impôts avec des méthodes d'administration qui sont très anciennes. Donc quand il faut apporter un changement en digitalisant totalement toute la chaîne de traitement de l'impôt foncier, il y a bien entendu des résistances dont il faut tenir compte. Donc, je crois que c'est un aspect important que nous souhaitons partager avec vous. La dimension gestion du changement, gestion de la transition doit occuper une place importante dans toute initiative qui vise à digitaliser le processus de gestion de l'impôt foncier. Un autre élément également qu'il faut prendre en compte, c'est que souvent on a l'habitude, dans les projets de digitalisation, de reprendre à l'identique les différentes étapes de la procédure manuelle. C'est ce qu'on appelle plutôt une informatisation. Donc, si la digitalisation doit se résumer à prendre exactement les étapes du manuel vers un traitement informatique, souvent on manque d'efficience dans le processus. Donc, l'autre élément également que nous avons appris, l'autre leçon que nous avons apprise, c'est quand il faut digitaliser, il faut d'abord commencer par faire une ingénierie de la procédure, rationaliser la procédure, voir comment on peut réduire les étapes, comment on peut supprimer certaines étapes qui paraissent superflues avant de penser à la digitalisation. L'objectif, in fine, c'est de faciliter pour le contribuable qui doit payer, la façon de déclarer et de payer l'impôt, de faciliter pour les administrations qui sont impliquées dans le processus l'amélioration des processus de travail et faciliter également et rendre plus efficaces les agents qui travaillent soit au niveau de l'administration fiscale, soit au niveau de l'administration du Trésor, ou soit au niveau de la collectivité territoriale. Donc, pour en finir, les recommandations que nous formulerons à l'endroit des autres participants, si vous me le permettez, bien entendu, c'est d'abord une procédure de digitalisation du moins, a une dimension de gestion des changements importante qu'il faut intégrer. Ça, c'est une première recommandation que nous faisons à l'endroit de ceux qui comptent lancer ce genre d'initiative-là. L'autre recommandation qui nous paraît également importante, c'est d'avoir un acteur, une administration qui est responsable de la gestion de l'impôt foncier. Comme je l'ai indiqué au début, s'il y a trop d'acteurs qui interviennent dans le même processus, les impôts, le trésor, les collectivités territoriales, qui n'ont pas les mêmes méthodes de travail, qui n'accordent pas la même importance à ces projets, souvent on a des difficultés. Donc avoir une administration, quelle qu'elle soit l'administration des impôts, soit l'administration du trésor, ou alors donner carrément les moyens aux collectivités territoriales, les moyens techniques, financiers, et tout ce qui en sert pour qu'elles-mêmes puissent administrer l'impôt de façon efficace. Mais nous, notre préconisation, c'est qu'au niveau de l'administration fiscale doit avoir tous les pouvoirs, tous les moyens de pouvoir maîtriser intégralement la chaîne de gestion de l'impôt foncier, de l'identification du bien foncier, de la collecte des informations qui permettent de caractériser l'immeuble, d'évaluer sa valeur vénale, de calculer l'impôt, et également les moyens de paiement qui doivent être aujourd'hui digitalisés. Donc aujourd'hui, il nous semble en tout cas important d'avoir une administration unique qui puisse mettre en place un système intégré de gestion de l'impôt foncier qui soit totalement digitalisé. Nous paraît également un des éléments de succès dans tout projet qui vise à digitaliser le traitement de l'impôt foncier. Voilà, chers participants, quelques points que j'aimerais partager avec vous, tout en étant conscient que nous parlons à un public d'experts qui sûrement a d'autres expériences plus enrichissantes qu'il pourrait partager avec le Sénégal. Merci beaucoup pour votre attention.
Okay, I guess we say thank you, Mor. So. Into the project, into the planning, and in connecting data. I think what comes across more implicitly in what he said is that that's often very challenging when you have to work across multiple agencies to deliver an IT project that aligns processes effectively. And he talked a bit about the importance of having strong leadership, a key point of contact in leading these projects forward in order to navigate the complexity of working across multiple organizations and the general complexity of this kind of reform program. The second thing I'd flag that he highlighted in depth was the importance of having a strong change management process in place. As he described, in many cases when you're undertaking IT reform, that means you're not just making digital what was once manual, you're fundamentally changing your processes, you're changing the skills that people need to execute those processes, you're changing the character of people's jobs. And if you want to bring an administration along with you in undertaking that kind of a reform, you need to have plans in place to manage that change, to provide training and support to staff, to reorganize the way administration functions, and so forth. And that then flows into the third point that he really emphasized in depth, was the importance of having a holistic strategy for reform. So not imagining that bringing a new IT system constitutes an entire reform program. Because an IT-based reform is only going to be successful and yield its full potential if it's combined with a broader rethinking and a reorganization of the systems that are used within the administration for guiding reform. And so you need alignment between new systems and new technologies to create success. He drew a distinction, which I quite liked. I don't know if I'm getting it right in translating from French to English, but between computerization and digitalization reform. He said, if you just take a manual process and start doing the manual process on your computer, that's just computerization. But it's not going to make the system all that much more successful. What we need is real digital reform that leverages the potential of technology to improve the systems that are running. But for that to succeed, there needs to be a clear plan in place that figures out what those processes look like and then pairs them with technology to improve outcomes. So I hope, no one can check on me, but I hope I've given a faithful recreation of what Mal had to share with everyone here. I think it's a very interesting project, and I'll just point to Bilal up front here, who's from that project for those who might want to know more about it in Mal's absence. Okay, having done that, let me go back to our panelists quickly before we go to the floor. So Xavier, you also talked about this issue of sort of having a holistic reform process. So this idea that it's not enough to just have computerization, but we actually want a broader reform of systems of which IT is a part. So I'm wondering if you might also want to share some reflections on that process.
Sure, thank you. So yeah, it's great to see that Moore and I share similar thoughts or visions. And so, as Moore said, I think it makes perfectly sense that the whole process of property tax administration needs to be very clear before you embark on an IT reform or an IT-led reform. So the first thing you want to do as an implementer is have a very clear vision of what you want to achieve and how you want to achieve it. And the vision goes far beyond identifying evaluation methods, but needs to include all aspects surrounding property taxation or every single aspect of a tax cycle. Once there is a shared vision among stakeholders, the procurement can start. And procurement also becomes significantly easier once you have a clear understanding of what you actually want to implement. Procurement, then obviously you need to comply with a couple of rules or local rules. But the goal is to then find a IT partner who is able to realize the vision that you've agreed upon internally as an implementing team. So ideally, software supports the implementation of a vision, but software ideally doesn't lead the reform in that sense. So exactly as Moore said, or as you summarized. Then, so sort of leading to that as well is whether IT-led reform always requires the development of a software, or whether you can go with off-the-shelf solutions. And I think when we're then talking about this, we need to address the quality of the software. So if software is interoperable so that it can integrate with a mobile app for data collection, that it can integrate with or share data with a centralized platform, makes the software flexible. If a software is configurable to a very large degree, it can be tailored to the local context. So hopefully, or possibly, it is not always necessary to find or to develop software from scratch, but off-the-shelf solutions, if developed properly, may actually provide a very good opportunity as well.
Great. Thank you very much, Xavier. Okay, now we're going to go back to Géraud. Alors, Géraud, tu as déjà discuté un peu le processus de réforme, les objectifs. Et maintenant, je veux que tu parles un peu
de l'expérience aussi des contribuables. Alors, ma question est, dans le cadre d'une réforme de technologie et du système sur la taxe foncière, comment comptez-vous faire adhérer les propriétaires aux réformes et le processus de réforme sur les fonciers? Merci beaucoup.
Ok, merci. Il faut offrir aux contribuables un système qui est assez convivial, attractif, simple, intuitif, pour qu'ils puissent être en mesure de déterminer lui-même le montant d'impôt à payer et de le payer avec beaucoup de facilité. Et on doit lui offrir également plusieurs modes pour y arriver. J'ai parlé tantôt des différentes possibilités de faire payer l'impôt foncier, comme la téléphonie mobile, la monnaie mobile, le virement bancaire, pour ne citer que ceux-là. Il y a aussi beaucoup d'autres moyens de paiement qui peuvent être utilisés. Si on offre la possibilité aux contribuables de ne pas être obligé de se déplacer pour aller vers un centre d'impôt pour payer son impôt foncier, je pense que cela augure d'une belle performance du recouvrement de l'impôt foncier. Et à ce titre, il y a beaucoup d'outils qu'on peut mettre en œuvre. Et depuis hier, en ce qui concerne l'identification, j'ai noté que des systèmes d'information géographique, GIS, sont mis à contribution pour pouvoir améliorer l'identification des propriétaires foncières. Et cette identification peut être aussi améliorée par d'autres outils plus affinés qui permettent, par exemple, le géoréférencement des propriétés foncières, et tant de choses qui permettent aux contribuables d'avoir tous les moyens de mieux comprendre ce qu'il fait et de se sentir vraiment impliqué et de croire que l'administration est en phase avec la modernité et s'inspire de tous les moyens pour pouvoir établir la qualité de service que l'administration offre aux contribuables. Ceci est d'autant plus important puisque nous sommes dans une démarche où toutes les administrations doivent pouvoir adopter les bonnes pratiques et faire en sorte que le contribuable, la satisfaction du contribuable soit au cœur de tout ce que nous faisons. Et c'est important de retenir cela. Je peux m'en arrêter là pour l'instant. Merci.
Merci beaucoup, Jérôme. Je pense que c'est important de nous souvenir que c'est aussi question d'interagir avec les contribuables. Encore, ce n'est pas seulement question de technologie, mais il y a du plus. Okay, I'm going to switch in English. So what we'll do now is we're going to open up to the floor. We unfortunately don't have Morfal with us for the questions, but you still have our two panelists. And so we're hoping, A, that anyone who has questions can bring them, but also I think we can welcome reflections and sharing of experience. As I say that, I'll emphasize we'd ask people to be brief in doing that, so we can hear from as many people as possible over the next half hour. But I think we're really aware that many people in this room have experiences trying to navigate IT-driven reforms of property tax systems. I know from talking to people over dinner, often those haven't been as successful as people would have liked. But I think what we're trying to do here is to learn from those experiences. So we'd invite any questions to the panel, but also, as I said, sharing of experiences related to strategies towards success or particular kinds of challenges that you've encountered in pursuing this kind of reform program. So the floor is open. I see a hand. That's okay, we see lots of hands. This is great. We'll trust our microphones. If you get a microphone, you can start. We'll start at the back. Alors, Salut, you can go first. John Cabea, tu vas être le prochain, oui? Okay. I think we need another microphone. Okay. John, peut-être tu peux commencer durant que nous trouvons le microphone.
Merci beaucoup.
Une seconde. Salut, you can go next. John, go ahead.
C'est John Kabea de l'administration fiscale de la République démocratique du Congo. Mes questions, je m'adresse à M. Xavier et M. Géraud. M. Xavier, pouvez-vous nous rassurer au jour d'aujourd'hui que dans les logiciels que vous allez mettre en place pour l'impôt foncier, précisément à Kananga, que nos agents de l'administration, non seulement ils vont travailler avec vous, mais ils auront l'accès dans ces systèmes et ils auront aussi la gestion de ces outils. Parce que c'est pour éviter ce que nous avons connu dans le passé avec un partenaire qui est venu, il a mis en place un système et il a verrouillé l'accès. C'est-à-dire, l'accès à ces systèmes devait être autorisé seulement à lui-même ou à ses agents qu'il avait à recruter. Du coup, une fois qu'il s'est absenté sur la ville, tout était bloqué, tout était aux arrêts. Pouvez-vous nous rassurer au jour d'aujourd'hui que vous n'allez pas vous rendre indispensable, vous n'allez pas faire en sorte de vous approprier seul le système en verrouillant l'accès à l'administration fiscale provinciale. Pouvez-vous aussi nous rassurer qu'avec vous travaillez avec les enquêteurs que vous avez à recruter, mais parmi ces enquêteurs, il n'y a pas les agents de l'administration fiscale. Alors, on ne sait pas du coup le travail que font ces enquêteurs. Est-ce que demain, après-demain, lorsque vous ne serez pas là, comment allons-nous pérenniser ces systèmes? Alors, au jour d'aujourd'hui, vous devez nous rassurer que dans vos équipes d'enquêteurs, vous allez prendre soin d'incorporer aussi les agents de l'administration fiscale. Comme ça, une fois que vous ne serez pas là, nous allons nous en charger de pérenniser ces systèmes à long terme. À messieurs, oh non, avant d'aller chez M. Géroux,
Je te demande d'être bref. Car il y a
ouais,
beaucoup de
je
mains.
suis encore chez M. Xavier. Quelles sont les variables que vous allez prendre en compte dans la mise en place de ces systèmes de logiciels? Est-ce que allez-vous utiliser des variables que vous avez à utiliser au Sierra Leone, ou bien vous allez vous baser sur la réalité propre de la vie de Kananga? À M. Giroux, si vous pouvez nous dire le variable utilisé au Bénin pour l'identification de propriété. Merci.
Merci beaucoup. We'll switch now in English. So I think we go next to Saliu. I hope your microphone is now working.
Good morning. Saliu Kamara for Ministry of Finance, Freetown, Sierra Leone. And in Sierra Leone, property tax is collected by two agencies. The rental tax is being collected by the National Revenue Authorities, while the property rate is collected by the 22 local councils we have in Sierra Leone. We started the digitalization in 2006 and 2007. But as you have noted from the discussion, we have this issue of vendor locking of the systems, right? In all of the councils, we have about 4 different systems. And for some of the councils, they have migrated to 2 or even 3 systems. After one fiscal year, they will either tell you that the system is now locked. We have to call the vendor before it can be operationalized. So the Ministry of Finance take lead in terms of managing the overall fiscal decentralization. So we thought we should move from decentralizing to now having one system. So I will want to understand from Xavier whether that approach is good, instead of us decentralizing to moving to a centralized system. as way of addressing the issue of vendor lock-in. In his submission also, he said one way to address it is to have a service level agreement. I want to understand from Xavier also, at which level do we have this service level agreement? Is it when we are preparing the terms of reference, or is it after recruiting the service provider? Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. I think we can take one or two more. Does anyone have a microphone yet? If not, I think we have Nara.
Bonjour et merci beaucoup, Monsieur Tossou, et ma question s'adresse à vous et aux autres fonctionnaires de l'administration fiscale dans la salle. Généralement, les pays mentionnent que quand ils reçoivent de l'assistance des pays en développement, des bailleurs de fonds, généralement, les outils informatiques, ils n'ont pas de contrôle sur le type d'outils informatiques qu'ils reçoivent. Et généralement, ces outils informatiques viennent de ces pays, du pays des bailleurs de fonds. Et généralement, ils sont aussi, ces outils informatiques ne sont pas sur mesure, mais prêts à l'emploi. Donc, je voulais savoir, est-ce que vous avez rencontré ce problème au Bénin? Est-ce que les autres ici présents ont rencontré ce problème? Et comment ils ont résolu ce problème? Merci beaucoup.
Merci, Nara. I'm going to take one more. I'm going to go to our online audience. I think if we can get a microphone here. So Camille is going to speak on behalf of our online audience. Or maybe Nick is going to speak on behalf of our online audience. So just one or two quickly, and then we'll come back to the panel. We have lots to keep track of here.
Yeah, there's only one very short question by David Solomon. Is a cloud-based system better for avoiding technology lock-in? Is a cloud-based system better for avoiding technology lock-in?
Okay, thank you very much, everyone, for the questions. Géraud, je pense que je vais passer premier la parole à toi. Alors, tout le monde en français, on donne un moment à tout le monde pour le casque. OK, tu peux commencer. Merci, Géraud.
Okay, merci. Je vais répondre à la question posée par John Kabia. C'est ça. Il a demandé à savoir quelle est la variable, quelles sont les variables utilisées au Bénin pour l'identification des propriétés foncières. Bon, dans ma présentation préliminaire, je disais que au niveau des villes à statut particulier, nous avons eu, grâce à la coopération française, à relever par vue aérienne toutes les propriétés foncières au niveau des 3 villes principales. Une fois que ces vues aériennes ont été captées, elles ont été, disons, monnayées ou bien transformées en des plans parcellaires, si bien que à chaque parcelle, on peut y associer son plan. Comment arrive-t-on à identifier une parcelle? Un système d'adressage a été mis en place que nous appelons QIP, quartier, îlot, parcelle. Le plan est fait de telle sorte qu'il y a plusieurs quartiers qui sont identifiés dans une ville. Au niveau d'un quartier, on retient plusieurs îlots et au niveau d'un îlot, il y a plusieurs parcelles. Pour aller plus loin, en ce qui concerne le bâtiment qui se situe sur une parcelle, à part les informations comme le code du quartier, le code de l'îlot et la lettre de parcelle, on ajoute le numéro du bâtiment. Donc pour adresser un bâtiment, par exemple, on aura besoin de savoir le nom du quartier, le code du quartier, le code de l'îlot et le numéro de la parcelle. Et toutes ces informations, comme je l'avais dit, sont enregistrées en bas de données et on peut y avoir accès. Voilà l'information que je pourrais donner en ce qui concerne cette question. La deuxième question qui m'est adressée provient du professeur Nara Monkam, c'est bien ça. qu'elle a fait remarquer que souvent, lorsque les partenaires au développement aident les pays à mettre en place les outils, les pays n'ont pas forcément la maîtrise sur ces outils parce qu'il n'y a pas de transfert de compétences ou bien il n'y a pas une pérennité pour le suivi de ces outils. Dans le cas du Bénin, le prestataire qui a été recruté pour mettre en place l'outil informatique pour la gestion du foncier, c'est un prestataire local. Je veux aussi rappeler que pour les vues aériennes qui ont été prises, les informations ont été reversées à l'Institut national de géographie du Bénin. Donc ce travail, les techniciens de cette structure ont été fortement associés pour que ces plans parcellaires-là soient établis. Et lorsqu'il s'agit de mettre à jour ces plans parcellaires, parce qu'il y a eu sur le terrain, par exemple, des scissions de parcelles ou bien des fusions de parcelles, les techniciens de l'Institut national de géographie sont en mesure de mettre à jour ces informations-là au niveau du plan. En ce qui concerne le logiciel de gestion foncière, comme je l'ai dit, c'est un prestataire local qui a été recruté et qui a eu un contrat et qui a mis en place cette application, donc, et qui travaille avec l'administration des impôts. Donc, il ne se pose pas, à mon avis, un problème à ce niveau en ce qui concerne le Bénin. Voilà quelques éléments de réponse. Merci.
Over to you, Xavier.
Thank you. I hope you're going to pitch in about cloud systems being suited to avoid vendor lock-in as well, so I don't have to take this by myself afterwards. I'm going to start with John Capella. Thank you very much for your questions, and I'm very glad that you're asking these questions. These are exactly the right questions that I would like to hear from an implementing agency. I'm not going to start with the question, or I'm going to start at the end of the questions that you asked. I am 100% with you that this reform that we're embarking on requires your involvement at every stage of the process. We shouldn't make any decisions on your behalf. You are the owners of this reform. So every decision that we're trying to do, we're going to do it with you, and you're going to lead the way. This also means that you will be involved in deciding which variables we're going to use to assess the values of the properties in Kananga. And given that the system that we're going to use is highly configurable, we can use any variable you want to use, basically. Throughout the implementation process, your staff will have to be involved. I would like to see your staff members, government members, involved in every aspect of the reform. This is the data collection, this is training on the IT system, this is setting up an inquiries and help desk, defining the administrative processes, the valuation, every single step. We would like to see your government staff heavily involved and leading the way. Because ultimately, exactly as you say, if we don't do this, there's no sustainability of reform. We, and I think I can speak on behalf of LoGRI here, we don't intend to do reform and then hand it over. Reform, the impulse comes from the government, and we are trying to facilitate and provide expertise and advisory to the reform that you want to embark on. But if you are not, so the work is going to be with you. We're going to advise and we're going to help. But there's not going to be any sustainability if you're not the ones leading the way. With regard to the software that you asked about, the software, as I said, is highly configurable. So this is a software that we co-developed with ICTD and LoGRI. And we've tried it before in Sierra Leone, in Freetown, in fact. And so without going too deep, the software is configurable in a sense that you can set up the roles and responsibilities people are going to have, so you can define the processes. You can define who sees what in the system. You own everything in that system. It's a software as a service, so there's a license fee that you pay on an annual basis, but in proportion to the revenue that you should be collecting, if implemented properly, it's tiny. But rest assured, we're going to make sure that you own this reform as much as possible. Mr. I have to talk faster, okay. Talk less. Mr. Kamara, you asked about how or what I think about centralizing a system in Sierra Leone. From what I understand, we're not necessarily centralizing a system. We're providing a system that has a centralized platform where relevant information for central government can be displayed. And so the central government has an understanding of what is going on the local government level. The software deployed, however, as I said before, is configurable. So we don't need to use the same variables for property valuation in Makeni as we're using them in Bo or in Kenema. There can even be different tax rates. So the valuation process can be different, the tax rates can be different, the templates for printing the tax bills can be different. If you want to, the payment deadlines and the penalties can be different. So it is highly configurable on a local level with a centralized dashboard. And when do we set up a service level agreement? As soon as possible, I would say.
Okay, thanks, Saver. I think the broad message, just to sort of summarize together a bit, I think what we're hearing from all of these questions is two big things. I mean, one is a fear of vendor lock-in and experiences of it. And second, a message that if reform is to be successful, then governments have to have control over that process, right? Ownership of their data, an ability to guide what the IT system looks like, an ability to guide the details of reform, and that all of that has to be embedded in some kind of a plan around how that system should evolve. I think we have time for a couple of more questions and quick answers. So let's see what we can do. I see, okay, we've got a microphone there. We'll go 1, 2, and 3. I don't know if we'll get to the 4th. It depends how long the questions are. Let me start at the back here.
Thank you. My name is Eliam Banda from Lilongwe City Council, Malawi. I have a question to, I think, both the presenters. I just wanted them to share experience in terms of interfacing the property rates or property taxation digitalization system with the other systems, because as you come in with the digitization, there will already be other systems at the organization. Can they share experiences? Is it easier to interface with accounting systems, banking systems? Thank you.
Merci. Jean-Claude Mondo du Cameroun. Alors, ma question s'adresse aux deux panélistes et ma contribution pour le docteur Nara. Alors, en ce qui concerne mes questions, nous avons noté hier que l'administration de l'impôt foncier peut être divisée en plusieurs cycles. Le cycle portant sur le registre des contribuables, sur l'évaluation, sur la taxation, sur le recouvrement. Alors, ma question pour Xavier notamment, c'est est-ce que la digitalisation doit être faite de manière globale pour l'ensemble des cycles, ou alors la digitalisation peut concerner uniquement chaque bout de ce cycle-là, et ainsi on pourrait ainsi résoudre le problème qui porte sur la multiplicité des acteurs. Lorsque nous avons plusieurs acteurs dans la chaîne, comme le rappelait tout à l'heure l'intervenant du Sénégal, lorsqu'on a plusieurs acteurs dans la chaîne, soit au début de la chaîne pour le registre des contribuables ou à la fin de la chaîne pour le recouvrement, peut-être que la digitalisation pourrait permettre de résoudre ce problème qui est lié à la coopération entre les divers acteurs. Maintenant, pour finir, je voudrais apporter une petite contribution en ce qui concerne les problèmes qui sont liés à l'utilisation ou à l'appropriation des outils qui sont généralement proposés par les bailleurs. De mon point de vue, et à partir de l'expérience que nous avons eue au Cameroun, les problèmes peuvent être de deux types. Soit l'outil qui est proposé a des spécificités techniques qui ne correspondent pas à la législation locale. Je pourrais prendre le cas d'un outil qui est proposé alors que les données le cas où les données sont hébergées dans le cloud, alors qu'en réalité, la législation locale exige que les données soient hébergées dans des serveurs locaux. Et dans ce cas-là, le problème est résolu immédiatement. Alors que pour le deuxième cas, ça pourrait être le problème lié à la propriété intellectuelle même de l'outil qui est proposé. Et dans ce cas, tant que la question de la transmission des codes sources en tout début des discussions avec les bailleurs, si ça n'a pas été réglé, et forcément on aura des difficultés qui sont liées. Donc je voudrais vraiment faire la distinction entre ces deux spécificités. Merci.
Merci. Last one here, please. Speakers, prepare. You'll have about 1 minute to answer, so be ready.
Good morning. My name is Damakrin from Kenya Revenue Authority, KESRA. My question goes to all the panelists. Have you considered, on the issue of vendor blocking, have you considered engaging escrow agents? If you have, please share the experience you had with the escrow agents. Before you start the work in a particular administration, do you develop data protection or security policies with, and this, I think it goes to the question that John asked earlier, I know you said that they own the data, but do you have any data protection or security policies in place before you actually start the work? And finally, where there has been some work that has been ongoing, do you recommend data cleansing and the migration before digitalization, or have you done it concurrently, the cleansing concurrently as you digitalize? Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. I'm sorry to the other hands, but we don't want to cut too much into the coffee break, or we'll be in big trouble. Je vais passer premier à vous, Jérôme. Mais très très bref, tu peux prendre ce qui t'intéresse, 1 minute, maximum 2. Ça marche?
Ok, merci. Monsieur Erion Banda a posé la question de savoir s'il y a une interopérabilité entre les bases de données qui s'occupent du foncier. Au Bénin, nous y travaillons, nous n'en sommes pas encore là, puisque nous avons l'intention de faire échanger les différentes bases de données qui s'occupent du foncier, les bases au niveau, disons, du cadastre qui est en cours de construction, les bases qui renseignent sur les transactions foncières, puisque vous savez que la propriété foncière peut changer de propriétaire d'un moment à l'autre. Et lorsqu'il y a par exemple des changements physiques au niveau des propriétés foncières, comme je l'avais dit tantôt, les fusions ou bien les scissions, les divisions de parcelles, il faut qu'en temps réel, des bases puissent se communiquer pour que l'information soit mise à jour et pour avoir toutes les conséquences attendues. La question posée par M. Jean-Claude Mondo, est-ce que la digitalisation peut être seriée par l'eau, identification, évaluation et autres? Bon, j'ai compris de nos échanges que nous avons depuis hier que la priorité est donnée d'abord à l'identification des propriétés foncières. Et ensuite vient la question de l'identification des propriétaires et leur attachement à ces propriétés foncières. En ce qui concerne l'évaluation des propriétés foncières, plusieurs méthodes ont été proposées et je pense que des personnes mieux indiquées que moi peuvent en parler. Merci.
Merci beaucoup. So Jean-Claude, to add to what Jérôme just said, you also asked whether it makes more sense to develop a global system or a system consisting of different modules provided by different providers. I think ultimately the question, so if you want to use different providers, it's more work on a contractual level, setting up service level agreements with all of them, but it's not a bad idea. But ultimately, what you want to have with the piece of software that you are using is modularity and interoperability. So the software, whether it's a global software or individual pieces, the software has to be modular so that it can be suited to the local context. If, for example, you want to do valuation, identification, and tax bill delivery, but you want to have the entire finance and accounting tool outside because you have a centralized or you have a well-established finance and accounting tool, then the software that you've acquired should function perfectly if you drop the finance and accounting tool that is inherent to the software that you acquired and replace it through an API with the software that you've already been using. And so the key question, I think, is, or the key response in that sense is, software needs to be highly modular and highly interoperable through APIs so that you as an implementer or as a client have all the flexibility that you could possibly need.
Great. Thanks, Xavier. The panelists nodded at me to answer your questions, Damakrin. So 1 minute from me, and then we'll wrap up. I think you've asked about data protection. I think the basic answer from where I sit is it's a very good idea, as we've heard from the audience, to be very clear about who owns the data and equally who has access to the data. Taxpayer data belongs to the government, and they should be able to control who has that access, and certainly to control the data securely. This question of data migration from old systems to new systems, I think we can see it broadly. It's part of this broader point that technology alone is not the solution to reform challenges. As you well know and underpinning the question, if you have bad data in an old system and you take that bad data into a new system, the new system is not going to be very successful. I think in experiences we've had, sometimes there's been an effort to migrate old data into a new system with a lot of cleaning going into that, and it's a big job. In other places, I've seen governments decide just to get rid of the old data and start fresh, because the old data was so difficult to clean that starting fresh was more practical. I think that's a country level decision, but I think putting an emphasis on that data cleaning before migration is so important to success. And then you mentioned this question about escrow agents. For those who don't know what this means, this is the idea that if you buy source code, that the developer could put their source code sort of in a vault. And if they somehow disappear, then the source code will go to the country so that they're not stuck. I think that, to me, that's one of many ways that governments can try to ensure that if their vendor isn't being supportive, they still have flexibility. And I think the key message that we've heard from everyone in the audience on the stage is, if you're going to procure an IT system, the government needs to own the process of developing it and make sure it serves their needs. But second, they need to have a strategy to make sure that if that vendor is not being responsive in the future, they can still ensure sustainability. Whether that's open source code, whether that's escrow, whether that's using an open platform architecture, there are different ways of thinking about it, but that's essential. We're now at time, and I know people want their coffee. So let me just wrap up very quickly by saying two things. First, thank you everyone for your patience with the technology problems. I really am going to embrace the idea that this was a lesson of the difficulty of technology. Even if the technology exists, it doesn't guarantee that it will work. And so much of IT reform is about getting the system that will work in practice and getting people ready to do that. The second thing I'll say, for those who are staying on day 3, we have an extended, more technical workshop to discuss these questions about the the nuts and bolts of IT systems, their design, their implementation. So we look forward to continuing that discussion there, but also in the hallways, because I know there were lots of other hands out there looking to contribute to the discussion. So thank you very much to our speakers. Thank you to Mar, Fal, in absentia. Thank you to the audience. Enjoy your coffee. We'll see everyone back in half an hour in this room for the next sessions. I'll just ask everyone to quite quickly get up and leave the room so that we can adjust the room for the next sessions, because we again need to partition. So please don't linger here. There's nice snacks and coffee outside. So we can migrate out, we'll get the room ready. We'll start again in 30 minutes. And we're going to have an official conference photo at the end of the day so that we don't fall too far behind schedule. Thanks, everyone.
Good afternoon, everyone. Please take your seats. If you're outside in the foyer having tea, coffee, and conversation, please come inside and take your seat. Thank you. I hope you all had a lovely lunch. Right. Can I ask, hello? Can I have everyone's attention, please? Hello? Thank you. So welcome back to the afternoon session. This is the last plenary for today, and I'm pretty excited about it because, of course, of the topic. I will be introducing the panel, but before I do that, I needed to make an announcement regarding tomorrow's technical sessions. Now, we've turned, it's a good problem, we're oversubscribed. So we would like to ask you at this moment to, where's the QR code? I need it. So there's going to be a QR code displayed in just a minute. And if you would kindly, if you registered for the session, the technical sessions tomorrow, if you're registered, kindly scan that QR code right now. Go to the form, fill out the form, and submit by 4 p.m. today so that we can allocate you to the spaces that are available. You're not priority, I'm sorry. Okay, so let's now go into the panel. Now, this panel, this afternoon's panel is, okay, if you could please settle down. Thank you.
And obviously the exact structure of government will differ depending on which country we're talking about and what institutional and legal structures. But in all government contexts, government itself isn't a homogeneous entity. In fact, I was talking to some colleagues and we were saying, wouldn't it be nice if as a government we always worked as one government? But even government within themselves can have disagreements about how reform should take place because it could result in different outcomes for different government entities. And governments are made up, obviously, of political wings, who, as we heard yesterday from the governor, don't like to lose votes. They're made up of technocratic wings. There may be impacts on jobs from reforms. But they're also made up of, and this is important to remember, those unofficial, official opinion leaders who also shape leadership and how it works. And so we can't think of reforms in isolation. We have to think of how reforms impact and affect different people. We have to build this into our reform process, where, for example, you may have to build in mitigation mechanisms for some who may lose out. You may have to build in communication mechanisms for some who may think they're losing out, but they're not actually losing out. And all of this makes property tax reform a complex process, not an easy technocratic solution. And so multi-stakeholder engagement that requires careful navigation to build this reform, to build this public support for reform, and to manage the competing interests when it comes to it, is what we are here to discuss today with my distinguished panel of speakers. Now, you know the format already. Everyone will be giving their opening statement. We'll have some questions and discussion here. But please be thinking of your own questions and also your own experiences that you can contribute to this debate. As I said, especially as it's the last panel, it's the last panel, but it's the beginning of the future discussion that we will all have together. So this is really a way to start saying like, oh, okay, I hear something that's interesting, but in my experience, this has not worked out, and maybe to get a colleague from another city or another entity, maybe a researcher, to say, oh, actually, you know, I have an idea here. So use this space today from this discussion to really bring out those points. But without further ado, I want to first introduce, I'm laughing because she was asking me whether I can say her name, Dr. Colette Nirakamana. Is okay? Excellent. Who's the research lead for LoGRI and has been deeply involved in multiple property tax reforms across the continent. Colette, please.
Okay, great. Okay. So thank you very much, Astrid, for this introduction. In light with what Astrid really introduced, which is the importance of building public and political support for reform, I would also like to give an opening statement that reflects on the importance of that. And the first thing that I'm going to do is to show how it's important by contrasting it with what hasn't worked. And this is really a lot of things that has been done by reformers, governors, stakeholders, government stakeholders, which is to try and push for more improvement in terms of technical and technological capacities, and hoping that these investments in capacities can yield better results. But we can see over time in many, especially African countries, that those investments, yes, have probably changed a little bit the property tax systems, but when we try to assess that in light with revenue mobilization, we don't see significant changes. It's very common for local governments to say that we don't have enough money. We barely even can cover our operation costs. We can barely cover our salaries. We can barely cover our other administrative costs. We don't have enough money to do more. The other thing is, when we think about technology, technology has been a panacea. I think it has been thought as, oh, this is the solution. You need to invest in technology and it will work. But again, we see that technology has probably improved a little bit in terms of administrative processes for tax reforms. But again, to what extent have these technologies also managed to improve revenue mobilization? It's also an issue here. So with that in mind, and I'm speaking also based on the research we have done with LoGRI, my research also, in my PhD, I did a lot of work in revenue mobilization. We have noticed that there are various forms of political resistance to reform. So although you invest in capacity, if you don't think about the politics, the political economy of reforms, things won't work. And in this case, we can rather see the key actors who can sometimes resist reform. And those actors can be politicians, first of all, who may resist change because they may lose votes if they support that change, or some may be inclined to resist payments because usually a new system brings in everyone into the tax net, and some people may resist, and those who are even well-positioned can do that strongly. The second is actors within the administration who also tend to maintain the status quo. And in this case, if you bring change, they may resist it from different strategies. So in this case, it also becomes difficult if you invest in capacity to not consider that resistance from the administration. And the third category of actors is obviously taxpayers. And resistance will come from the fact that, again, it's something we hear in many African countries, governments are doing nothing, we don't receive services, they are not happy. So if anything comes and they say, we are even going to implement a reform that is even going to push you to pay more tax liabilities, obviously they will resist. And resistance also comes from taxpayers, but mainly the politically connected ones who can afford payment, but because they are politically connected, they can also manage to find ways of avoiding that payment. So we see that political support is very important, or it needs to be taken into account when we think about reform, because as Astrid said as well, reform is not something that happens over the night. It's a long-term endeavor, and commitment is very key to ensure that all the gains, investments that are put in place can also yield benefit results, better results, and political support is very important, political commitment is very important to ensure that even when other actors come in the long term, they won't be able to dilute that reform. And public buy-in is also important in this case because it can be an incentive for politicians to then keep pushing for better reform. If you have the public support, it's then difficult to be reluctant to improve on property tax payments. Now, there is also a second question which is about the strategies and priorities that government should seek in building public and political support for reform. So I would like to outline three, drawing on research and involvement that we had in different countries. The first is to examine the sources of political resistance. And this means when we are implementing a reform, it's important to map out the political context in which that reform is taking place so that we can know who are the actors who are key in pushing for that reform. Some can potentially resist. Some can also try to support that reform. So it's important to understand those actors, the incentives, and if some are resisting, design some incentives that can really allow them to be rather convinced that the change is good. The second strategy is to identify reform champions. It's very important. Although there is a lot of resistance, there are also some people who are willing to push for change. And when reformers bring on board those reform champions, they can be key in mobilizing support from their colleagues, their peers, and they can also push, in the case of politicians, for even legislative change. And the third, when you think about the administration, is also to reorganize the incentives. As I mentioned, change brings resistance, especially for the administration. And in this case, reformers need to think about how to convince the administration to be on board. And in terms of incentives, you can think about increasing salaries for people who are used to benefit from a very transparent system. It can be bringing in more training, showing that, look, there's a reform coming in, yes, there is a lot that is going to happen, but look, you also benefit from training and improve in terms of your skills and so on. It can also be improving working conditions. I wouldn't expand much on that, but I think it's very important, yes. Now, at the level of public support, it is also key for reformers to ensure that there is a strong link between revenues and services. I will expand on that later. The second one is to create avenues for citizens and local authorities' engagements. It's also something that is very lacking when we do interviews with taxpayers, local authorities. We see that there are no avenues for good engagement to allow taxpayers or citizens in general to ask questions to local authorities about how are you using our money? What kind of services are you providing? So it's very important to allow that. And the last thing is to increase citizens' trust in tax authority through the implementation of effective communication strategies that will then convince taxpayers in the context of the reform that the system is fair. Because if that fairness is not demonstrated, then taxpayers can resist. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Colette, and you've brought up some very interesting challenges, but I think what's more important, ways to overcome those challenges, and we'll come back to some of those in the questions. The next speaker also my former colleague, Abubakar Kamara from Sierra Leone Freetown, IGC country economist for Sierra Leone, but also part of the Freetown City Council reform team. So ABK, if you could just give us sort of your initial thoughts on this, perhaps building on what Colette has said, and from your own experiences being very deep in the middle of some of the most impressive reforms that are going on in terms of property tax.
Thank you very much, Astrid. I mean, just building on what Colette just said, I'll focus my discussion on the Freetown experience. Of course, we all know that there's every need for public and political support, and the issues are largely the same. But I'll just try to maybe just bring forward some of the initiatives that we tested in Freetown, and then perhaps how those help in navigating some of the challenges that we face. I mean, as has been stated, the ultimate goal of any tax reform is to address, well, not just the technical challenges, but to ensure that there is compliance to a very large extent. And while compliance might be difficult, especially 100% compliance might be difficult to achieve, if not impossible, but I think building political and public support for any reform may facilitate buy-in and ownership, which might significantly encourage voluntary compliance. It is very important to make conscious effort. I mean, sometimes we tend to think that, or we tend to focus our effort on technical issues, but I think the Freetown experience suggests that conscious effort needs to be made to building political as well as public support across all the stages of the reform effort. In addition to encouraging compliance, building political support may also promote seamless handing over, and that we've seen in the case of Freetown, and thereby making the reform relatively sustainable. I mean, there are some strategies that have already been discussed here, and that is articulating the benefit of the reform to policymakers, the effective use of tax reform to enhance public trust, transparency, sensitization of and public education. But I would, like I said, I'll just narrow down to the Freetown experience. And in the case of the Freetown experience, overall, the reform sought to emphasize fairness and equity of the system and links to services to build support. Although the reform faced some administrative and political resistance, our study indicates that it was actually quite popular among taxpayers, 70% of whom expressed general support for the reform, despite large increase in the rates during the pandemic. I mean, linked to effective tax, the use of tax revenue to enhance public trust, we piloted an initiative was introduced, that is the participatory budgeting system using digital channels. I mean, this happened at the time when we had the pandemic. Initially, we had planned to do, in-person meetings. Unfortunately, because of the pandemic, we then used digital channels. And this involved randomly selecting properties from different wards. In Freetown, there are, I think, about 49 wards. We selected 30 wards. And then we requested participants to vote on an investment of about $1,500. This was done with the hope that it could inform. I mean, we had a mayor that was very progressive. The thinking then was some percentage of whatever is collected from the ward would be invested into the wards, about 20-25%. And we found that public confidence in and support for council increased significantly among those who participated. Like I said, there are several levels of resistance in Freetown. There was one with the public and also with the central government. We had a situation where the mayor was coming from the opposition, and then you have central government. I mean, navigating those challenges for some of us, especially for policymakers, could be very, very difficult. So we were faced with the situation of how do we navigate those challenges? First is, what do we do in the short term? We want to sustain the reform. And so we try to mobilize external funds to finance the initial phases of the reform, that is system design, initial phases of implementation, printing, delivery, just so that to avoid the collapse of the system. Sell the reform to central government. I mean, when it started, as we all know, the mayor will also want to use this as a political gain. And she's considering it as a flagship, and that is our project. But then central government is resisting because central government does not want the mayor to think that to use the reform as a way to score political goal. So we then think of ways of sending it to central government. So we try to identify champions from between central government, organize meetings and discuss the reform models as well as the benefits to not just council but also to central government and by extension to the rest of the country. We also tried as best as possible to depoliticize the reform discussion. Like I said, obviously as a politician, even though the mayor, I mean, I would say in the case of council was a champion, but again, we want to depoliticize such that we could also get buy-in from central government. So we ensure that the discussions were largely technical to avoid it being depoliticized. We support the reform in central government aligned cities. In fact, as we speak, we are in Kenema. Kenema is a pro-government city. So this is just in a way to ensure that at least the model in Freetown, which is an opposition city, is at least replicated. And government will just think that this is something that will go on and is good for not just Freetown, but also the rest of the country. Thank you.
ABK, I think that's just sort of the tip of the iceberg in terms of the reform, and I look forward to coming back. But just some of the links I already heard with Colette's presentation. You had a reform champion to start with, and then you sought more reform champions from different stakeholders. And I think it just bears worth re-emphasizing that you actually, 70% of people supported the reform in the context where they were going to pay more and in the context of a pandemic. And I just want to highlight that to everyone here because we always come back to, oh, there is going to be political resistance, and sometimes we just assume it. We have here data from Freetown that says if you can do it well, people may support it too. So this is the flip side. But now we're going to travel across back to the other side of Africa, to the country we're in now. And Dr. Abraham Rugo, who's the country manager for the International Budget Partnership in Kenya, is going to give his opening remarks from a different perspective, a different institutional background and environment from here in Kenya. So please, Abraham, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Should I assume this is working? Oh, good. Thank you so much, Astrid and colleagues, for this conversation. It's been absolutely amazing just to listen to all of you tax people. And tax wannabe people, and perhaps a few of us in the resistance movement. I say that very deliberately because tax and tax revenues, it's not a conversation that is a very public conversation. And a lot of it has to do with history, that because it's by law, and the law, you know, almost that, I think it's the Kenya Revenue Authority Acting Commission General, who said that there are only two sure things, tax and death. The relationship already is very scary when you put those two in the same sentence. I say this because I come from a background of working with citizens engaging in public budgets. And a lot of our conversations have actually centered on the expenditure side of this discussion. And rarely do we go into the tax conversation. And the reason for that is just the tax laws and the tax system is as complicated as it can get. Let me give you an example. This year, and I know we are coming to property rates, but this year in the national government, the conversation around taxation because of this, just the state of cost of living, has attracted the greatest interest. But one of the most funny comments that went around is people are saying, we don't want this finance bill. We have never had it before, so we don't want it. Only to be told that, by the way, the finance bill has been passed for every year, and the taxes you pay are based on a law. I start there because an appreciation that the process of taxation and how taxes are spent is actually more political than is technical is a good starting point. Often, this conversation is viewed as a technical conversation. It's about how big is the rate, what is the tax base, and all those things, all those calculations, you know, the valuation rolls, all the things I have had here from yesterday. And then you put that in law, and by putting it in law, people are supposed just to obey or pay the consequences. And the consequences are harsh, the penalties that come with it and all that. And therefore, for me, I think a starting point is that, acknowledging that this has to be seen as a political process and not just a technical process. And therefore, the buy-in is not based on the soundness of the technical arguments. It is actually based on the perception of the government suggesting to collect this tax and the perception of how that resource will be utilized. And therefore, that invites us to a public deliberative model, a discussion, a deliberation. I like what Colette has just said about the involvement of citizens. But this is beyond just, you see, in the expenditure side, public participation, as tokenistic as sometimes it gets, is very easy because people come and say what they want to be done in their areas. They want a bridge constructed, they want a sewerage mechanism put in place, they want the potholes covered. Kampala just did something very interesting, as we were told yesterday. But when it comes to the revenue side, rarely is there a conversation about the kind of, and therefore it becomes a deliberation. What exactly does this mean? So that it's just beyond a rate, but it's more public education, it's public engagement with the point of coming to a deliberation of we are giving these taxes for the following purposes, and therefore this is what we expect in return. And that public deliberative model goes beyond just the input side of things. But the second part of it is the feedback and reason giving. Now, a lot of the law, and including what we are discussing here around taxes, never has a mechanism of giving reasons as to why certain options were picked and not others. It is almost like it's a matter finito. Once the law has been passed, that's it. Your job is to pay your rates. And if you don't pay, your rates will come for you. But perhaps giving reasons, because it's a democratic kind of deliberation, giving reasons would win more people, because as I've said, really, this is a political process, and a political process is about persuasion, is about a conversation, is about engagement. And therefore, that feedback mechanism, again, I use an example of just what has happened with the finance bill at the national level in Kenya. For the first time, we have a report that gives feedback, clause by clause. This is what people said, this is what we agree with, and this is what we decided. It's a very interesting report. It's like 200 pages, or almost line by line. What would happen if that was to happen at a community level where some of these property rates are being discussed, within the counties, where the issues are even closer to the people. The rates, the people paying, are closer to their governments, because that's the essence of local governance, as it were. The last one, which I will not emphasize so much now, is the whole idea that taxation is as good as the services being provided. We cannot overemphasize that. I think the social contract conversation cannot be overemphasized, because the idea around property and anybody owning property is that it increases in value. Value of a property also has to do with the services around that property. The type of roads, the type of sewerage mechanism, water provision, and all that. And therefore, if that end is not being honored, then the conversation on property tax is really dead on arrival, as it were. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. I couldn't agree with you more that it's two sides of the same coin, yet we may only always look at them as separate entities. But you talk about citizen engagement in the budget. And I must say, some of the city governments I work with, they sometimes get frustrated, either from experience or from assumption, but citizens don't want to engage, right? And so actually on this point, I want to come back to you, ABK, because you mentioned in your sort of opening statement this participatory budgeting process that you linked with your property tax reform. And I was wondering whether you could give us a little bit more detail of that, because it's really the most direct way citizens can engage with the budget.
Yeah, thank you very much, Astrid, and I largely agree with you. Like I said, we started this reform prior to the pandemic. And then the thinking then was, how do we get citizens to participate, and how do we encourage voluntary compliance? So we organized property owners into WhatsApp groups, in 30 words. And we had them discuss among themselves horizontally, that is, participants discuss among themselves. And then there was also just to understand from them, from among themselves, what they think is a priority for their communities. Like I said earlier on, we have $1,500. The loan equivalent of that is about 50 million. That's relatively very small, but at least just to test the concept. And so clearly we got a shopping list of what they prefer, and those list was ranked. And then we had vertical interaction. That is the councillor of the ward talking to the participant and revealing the list that was generated. A decision was made, and that decision was communicated by the mayor, announced the winning project. And the services were delivered based on what was selected by the participant. We went further to notify participants via text messages about the implementation of the project. So, I mean, these are some of the key results. We realized that, one, the process strengthens the input and output components of the fiscal contract. That is respondent perception that they have opportunities to voice their opinion about government matters to government officials increase significantly. And it's easy to directly engage in political activities. On tax compliance, we realized that tax compliance was not significant, and we tried to unpack why. Why is it that tax compliance was not significant? First, we realized that other supporters of the mayor, compliance among them increased significantly, whereas it was negative for those that are opposed to the reform. But then attitude towards government, we realize there's positive shift in attitudes towards government. And we think that may facilitate a virtuous circle of improvement by increasing future compliance. This is something that perhaps we could test going forward. But specifically, we saw that there is positive and significant increase in the approval ratings of the political leadership. Again, perception of transparency, efficiency, and corruption after the reform also changed very significantly. So this is just some of the interesting results that we saw, and we think that perhaps going forward, we will see the impact of especially the attitude towards government, how it could contribute to increasing compliance.
Thanks, ABK. So we have now an example of where a government has figured out how to do some of the links between revenue and services. But in many of the cases, the link doesn't exist. Colette, you mentioned it in your opening statement. And I feel like, we've now heard a positive example, but we take it always as an example because it's the example. My question to you, Colette, based on your experience, why don't we see more of these examples? Why is this link so weak between revenue and services?
Yeah, thank you very much, Astrid. I think I'm enjoying this discussion. It seems like you're touching on, some similar topics here. And thanks for your question too. So I'd like to answer your question, let's say from two angles. The first one will be to say, yes, there is a real weak link. And the other one is that there can be a perceived weak link. Okay. So now, for the real weak link, again, many governments in Africa have worked in Ghana, Malawi, Senegal, but we can think about other countries. We see that, as I mentioned also in my opening statement, government don't mobilize enough revenues, which means that they can't provide enough services. So, for instance, they may try to provide waste collection services, but they may not even be able to do a full coverage of the city. So most of the time, this is because the revenue is not enough, and what is even raised is used for other things. And it's common to see that in many local governments, maybe it's only 10% of not even property taxes, but local revenues that are used for services. So this really creates a weak link. And I would also give an example of the case of Malawi, where we conducted workshops and we had the opportunity to meet taxpayers. And we could hear that they are really not happy with the fact that they can see the city providing waste collection services in specific parts of the city and not some, and they were wondering why. And of course, the response is we don't have enough money, so we can't do that, which is understandable, it's justified. In cases where governments will rely on central government transfers to provide services, yes, services will be provided, but if those grants from the central government are earmarked for specific services, it means that local authorities will just fund those services that the central government has defined, and they may be different from what citizens want. They may really be different from citizens' priorities. Now, from the angle of perceived weak link, I think I can try to explain that for two reasons. The first is the fact that governments sometimes don't do a good job to communicate the kind of service that they're providing. We can't assume that there are no services. Services are done, maybe not as we wish, but they are provided. So this lack of communication pushes citizens, especially those really who are keen to know what the local government is doing, to generalize the fact that, oh, we don't receive services, things are going bad, we are not happy, and so on. So again, in giving the case of Ghana, I was conducting interviews with taxpayers on one side and local governments on another side. And it was good that I was meeting those two actors. And taxpayers are saying that, oh, we are not happy, waste collection is not done in a specific location, local government is doing nothing. Then I went to interrogate local actors asking, why are you not providing services? And they said, what we're gonna do probably is to spend a week without doing waste collection, and then they will see that we are providing services. And I guess, again, the key message here is, it's not that all services are not provided, it's just that there is really this issue about communication. And I think it's really on local governments. They should really do a good job to try and inform taxpayers that, look, we are trying our best to provide services, and these are the kind of services that we are providing. Otherwise, this dissatisfaction can rather lead to low tax compliances, although there are some services provided. And that can be also justified and encourage more tax compliance. The first is also that the first reason for this perceived weak link is that if I'm a concerned citizen trying to understand exactly how governments are spending my revenues, it will be difficult. Simply because many government budgets are not structured in a way that allows us to understand how a specific source of revenue has been used for a specific service. What we see is rather budgets that are so broad in terms of the categories of revenues that have been mobilized, and on the expenditure side, we see also broad categories of services provided. So it's difficult to really scrutinize and say, okay, among, in the property tax revenues that you mobilize, I can see that you spend 10% on services. So I would like to conclude that these kind of budget structures, it keeps us having more
try and engage with citizens around the budget. And I would love to hear your thoughts on that particular point. Can we make budgets better and therefore engage citizens better? But also what happens in a context when you make budgets transparent, in a situation where property tax revenue is weak, you still have salaries of government officials to pay, right? And I know that this is a concern in some of the cities I work in, where citizens are like, well, it's all just going to go pay for salaries for government officials, but it needs to, right? The government officials need to do that. So once you make it transparent, they see where the money is going. And generally, that link is then questioned because the trust in government and the trust in law is weak, right? So what are your thoughts on that, and what are your thoughts on sort of, that link between revenue and services?
Thanks. A key part of budgets and budgets improvement is to try and not only say what is being done, but what it's trying to achieve. And a lot of the reforms around budgeting in our countries have to do with program-based budgets. And program-based budgets, the whole idea around it is you don't just say how much you're spending, for instance, on early childhood education, or because of what we are talking about on sewerage improvement, but basically how much of it, what are you trying to improve? So how many homes are going to be, for instance, connected to the sewer, or are going to, how many roads are going to be paved and things like that. And that's a major reform, because what that does is that then it starts to bring life to the budget. Numbers in and of themselves mean very little, because citizens don't wake up thinking about budget numbers. They wake up thinking about the road that is not passable. They wake up worrying about the medical facility that does not have drugs and the like. So that's one big major step, and the work we do here in Kenya, we actually assess all the counties. It's interesting, actually, last week, but we were in this very room launching the results of the County Budget Transparency Survey that looks at all the 47 counties in Kenya and how they are performing from a transparency angle. And let me give an example, because you have asked, what does transparency actually mean? One of the counties that had improved most in this current survey, so we do it every year, and we look at how much budget information is available and how comprehensive is that information. And we also look at just the detail of their revenue by source. Do they provide that kind of information? We had to try and correlate it with services, because that's still a big job. But Makueni County, and for the Kenyans in the room would understand this, over the last 5 years was voted as one of the best in terms of service delivery. And one of the things that they actually, so first of all, we see they have improved in their score of transparency, so they made much more budget information, but they also brought down the level of engagement to the actual points of service delivery, so that citizens could see, and even the collection of basically different revenues at the county level, or at that level. And therefore, it was very easy even for citizens to be able to connect, what kind of services, the perception, because it's not all services that can be provided for. And that's just one example. And as I've said, we really are yet to get to a point where we are able to correlate, one for one, revenue improvement and service delivery. But there are studies that have been done that basically show that. But the trust deficit conversation sits right in there. A big part of the trust deficit is the fact that governments, local governments, and even national government, as far as some of these rates that are not necessarily on the what you would call mainstream taxes, they are not VAT and what have you, are never collected with a specific intention or purpose. What I mean by that is that they are, the targets for local revenue collection are basically a deficit management strategy. In other words, once they have done their budget, they have established how much they will receive from the central transfers, then they have a deficit of X million, they say then that's our revenue target. And then they distribute it and say this one will come from property rate, from market rates, from business permits and the like. And that then becomes, even when you come to assessing how much of this were you not able to collect, there is no perhaps analysis. Now we are seeing more and more analysis being done. There is no perhaps analysis that told you this is the capacity for property rate collection, for instance. This is the capacity for business permits, or these are the number of businesses that we actually have in this area, and therefore we can collect from. Then it becomes even more difficult to then match it to what services are we going to do for this to be able to improve in terms. So for me, that connection has to be assessed against that there are certain services that are required, in those areas, but also bring it down to saying, when you give us so much, we are going to provide you with so much. So that then the contract moves from a social contract, which is assumed, to perhaps even a written one.
But so that's very interesting, but I want to push a little bit further on that. I'm going to stay with you, because it's obviously very easy to engage citizens on things they want to have, right? You said in your opening statement, we need to engage citizens better on what they need to pay. And so I wanted to ask you, what are your ideas in doing this? Because obviously this is a different conversation, right? From, well, I want a bridge, I want my waste collected, you know, that's an easy thing.
Yeah.
I need to pay this is a more difficult conversation. And how do you, I mean, because the ultimate aim from your statement is to increase the trust in the public sector to provide those services.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to push you a little further on actually looking at your ideas for the revenue side of this conversation.
So one of the things that, of course, that actually does bring a lot of struggle is the fact that I expect a certain set of goods and services provided, and therefore I imagine because I have paid my rate of so much, then they should be provided tomorrow. One of the ideas that is being we've tested it in a county called Baringo, is this whole idea around cost referencing. That in these deliberative conversations, so the public conversation, government actually can list and say, this is what it actually costs to provide this service. Now, there are many, and I would like to hear even from the room here, there are many perspectives for and against government publishing actually how much it costs to even connect a household with water, for instance. Because what used to happen is that citizens would come in, even participatory budgeting conversation, they have been allocated, say, $100,000 for their ward. Then they will come and give this long list of things. And then the officials, because they are not allowed to alter what public has said, they try to distribute the available money across everything. Then of course they are not able to do it. Let's come to the revenue side. You see, the revenue side conversation again comes to, first of all, an assessment of what is the capacity of, of the areas where this money is being collected. We have not done a very good job in terms of assessing the capacity of what is possible and what is not possible. As to whether people pay or not, there it must be a matter of persuasion. And persuasion, as we have said, really, it's either you are actually providing services, but you're also demonstrating goodwill in terms of how accountable you are in terms of how these resources are being spent. You could as well be providing the services, but at inflated rates, being able to to be transparent in how you're engaging. And then thirdly, the transparency also has to move to the point of publishing these valuation roles. Perhaps not naming and shaming. I've struggled a bit with the naming and shaming. I don't think that achieves much. But then finally is to assess the place of, and this was discussed yesterday, the place of, do you call them tax reliefs or exemptions, which normally, like in Kenya, are given during election time, and people are told, now you're free, don't pay for these. Because if then the good guys will have to pay, but the ones who don't really want to pay have to wait, then they wait for the day for the exemptions. They wait for the day for relief, because that day then you just get to pay very little in that sense. My thoughts.
Thanks, Abraham. Drawing on what Abraham says, in consultations, some voices are always louder than others. Some sectors of the public, as I said, public is not a homogeneous group, are always going to be louder than others. Women being a group that in some places are not very often heard, but who need specific services. So my question to you is, how can we ensure that all of this is fair, right? And how do we, through this, sort of build public understanding, therefore, for reform, not just amongst the few who shout the loudest, but amongst everyone who needs and pulls on those services?
Thank you very much for your question. I'm going to answer this one in French. So I'll give you just a few seconds to wear your headsets, and then I'll be able to answer. Okay, so I think you're ready. So, donc j'aimerais répondre à ta question, Astrid, plutôt en la situant dans un contexte de réforme, car c'est au moment que les gouvernements ont l'opportunité de faire plus que ce qu'ils devraient faire ordinairement. Et ici, je vais prendre l'exemple de l'évaluation foncière, property valuation. Donc, L'objectif de l'évaluation foncière est de bien estimer la valeur des propriétés et de se servir de ces valeurs pour ensuite calculer le montant des impôts à payer. Donc, le but ultime dans ce processus serait que les gouvernements s'assurent d'avoir une méthodologie cohérente et transparente qui garantit une équité horizontale, c'est-à-dire que des propriétés ayant une valeur similaire sont évaluées de la même manière et vont payer le même montant de taxes. Il devrait aussi garantir une sorte d'équité verticale, dans le sens où des propriétés à une valeur élevée devraient payer plus que des propriétés à une faible valeur. Donc ça, c'est un problème dans beaucoup de municipalités. On se rend compte que des fois, vu les problèmes liés à l'évaluation foncière, deux propriétés ayant des valeurs différentes peuvent finir par payer le même montant, et donc ça crée des problèmes d'injustice fiscale. Et donc ce qu'on remarque dans nos recherches, encore une fois, à travers les entrevues qu'on a conduites avec des contribuables, que ce soit au Malawi, en Zambie ou ailleurs, et que les contribuables, des fois, ne comprennent pas comment les valeurs de leurs propriétés ont été calculées, mais surtout, ils se demandent, OK, si, disons, ma propriété a été estimée de telle manière, est-ce que c'est la même chose pour mon voisin? Ou est-ce que mon voisin est en train peut-être de payer moins ou plus? Mais souvent, c'est est-ce qu'il est en train de payer moins? Et donc, en me référant au cas du Malawi, encore une fois, on a eu la chance de rencontrer les acteurs locaux, de même que les citoyens. On a entendu dire qu'il y avait des cas où, des fois, les citoyens, il y aurait des cas de collusion entre les évaluateurs et les citoyens, où les évaluateurs vont peut-être pousser les citoyens à payer une sorte à corrompre les évaluateurs pour avoir leur propriété évaluée à la baisse. Et donc ça peut créer des frustrations, parce que ceux qui arrivent à corrompre peuvent facilement devoir payer finalement des montants plus faibles d'impôts. Donc la conséquence de ce manque de transparence est donc une injustice fiscale plus prononcée. Et donc dans ce cas, pour répondre à la question d'Astrid, qu'est-ce qui doit être fait pour promouvoir cette justice fiscale, mais aussi promouvoir tout ce qui est compréhension de l'utilité de la réforme en général? Donc la première chose est de rendre la méthodologie de l'évaluation foncière transparente, donc en permettant aux contribuables, quand l'évaluation est faite, d'aller interroger les autorités locales pour demander comment est-ce que leurs propriétés ont été évaluées et obtenir des réponses. Dans le cas où il y a une sorte de dissatisfaction des réponses que les autorités locales donnent, les autorités locales peuvent se servir d'appui matériel pour justement montrer qu'il y a vraiment eu une justice dans cette évaluation foncière. Donc le cas de Freetown est un bon exemple où les avis d'imposition sont très détaillés. Ils montrent la photo de la propriété, comment la valeur a été estimée, le genre de caractéristiques qui a été estimé pour évaluer cette valeur. Et donc les citoyens peuvent savoir que, OK, finalement, c'est juste. Et donc, le troisième point, je pense, c'est de s'assurer que les contribuables sachent à quoi servent leurs taxes. Je pense que ça revient à la discussion qu'on est en train d'avoir ici, qui est de dire il faut vraiment que les gouvernements fassent un grand travail pour expliquer comment les taxes et les revenus sont utilisés. Et donc, oui, on s'entend pour dire comment les choses devraient se faire, mais disons dans ce cas, je pense que je veux aussi me focaliser sur la question de la sensibilisation citoyenne. Donc, cette sensibilisation repose sur plusieurs choses, mais la communication, encore une fois, devient très importante ici. Et quand on parle de communication, on ne parle pas juste d'un modèle de communication précis, mais vraiment d'une communication qui est adaptée à différents types de contribuables. Il y a des gens qui comprennent les choses d'une manière spécifique. Il faut que les gouvernements puissent mettre en place des programmes de communication qui permettent des messages clairs pour que les gens puissent comprendre pourquoi ceci est fait. Et cette communication doit se faire aussi à tous les niveaux de gouvernement. Il y a beaucoup de gouvernements où des fois il y a des niveaux, disons, municipaux, sous-municipaux, des fois au niveau du village. Au Kenya, on appelle ça des wards. Et encore une fois, cette communication doit non seulement être horizontale, mais aussi verticale, aller à tous les niveaux pour justement s'assurer que tout le monde comprend qu'est-ce qui se passe. Et c'est vraiment la clé, je pense, de la pluie populaire et de souligner que le système est juste et transparent.
Thank you, Colette. And I think your emphasis on communication is key. And ABK, I know that this was very central to the very comprehensive reforms to property tax. Now, as a self-professed municipal finance geek, I know that Sierra Leone is just about to have an election because we're all watching. Everyone who's been involved or associated with these property tax reforms is holding their breath and seeing what's going to happen. And that's where actually my question to you goes to, right? You have the reform champion till now, you've had the leadership and everything else. So you've had this political support to get the reform off the ground. But reforms are long-term things if they're going to yield the results, particularly with respect to property tax revenue. So how do you entrench reform? How do you make sure that there's not sort of a midway collapse? How do you overcome an election, which is something that you're facing right now?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think that's really very important. Simply because, as we all know, reforms, especially comprehensive reforms, takes a while. And policymakers are very impatient in terms of generating revenue. You know, we had that kind of challenge when we started with the Freetown City Council. So yes, we had a reform champion in the person of the mayor herself. But then at some point, you know, when you are in the office, you have several stakeholders coming in, selling different packages. At some point, even before the reform, there was someone from the private sector that I think reached out asking the mayor to outsource a collection. They were prepared to do outsourcing. I mean, trying to do outsourcing where you don't even know the potential of your city. You know, when there are a lot of systems challenges and there are gaps all over the place. And sometimes the challenges that we face, maybe as reformers, is that we tend to focus on the technical issues, and perhaps once perhaps you begin to see some buying, you think that it's done and dusted. I think one of the lessons we learned from Freetown is that it should be a continuous process. It's really very challenging because it involves a lot of time. It's really time consuming, but then it really helps because you understand not just what is happening with your reform, but what the plans are within the leadership of council, and what is it that you could do to ensure that things are not maybe just broken up. I give you the example of, again with Freetown. There was this private sector group that came in and almost convinced the political leadership, as well as the administrative leadership, that, okay, whilst you're waiting to reform, perhaps it would be good to outsource collection. You know, the fact that we were highly engaged as part of the process, what we did then was, okay, it may not be a bad idea, but let's tell you what the literature suggests. If you want to outsource, what are the issues? What are the advantages? What are the disadvantages? I think that helped greatly, to an extent that that decision was suspended, and we were able to get the mayor to think that, okay, let's wait until we are done. Let's at least understand what the potential is. So if we are discussing, we know what our potential is, and if we decide to outsource, at least we will be in a better position. So I think, like I said, it's really very challenging, but once you get buy-in, it's not one-off. Conscious effort should be made to ensure that you build on that relationship and see how you could use whatever the evidence suggests to continue to advise the process.
Thank you very much. I would like to hand it over to the floor now. We have a good 30 minutes for discussion. I think this has been a very rich introduction to some of the experiences that I'm sure echo with a lot of your experiences. So we're going to take questions in sets of 3. As usual, please try and keep your questions short so we can get through as many questions and comments as possible. Also, we'd love to hear your experiences with reforms, some of the challenges, but also the opportunities. So if you could raise your hand if you have a question, thought, comment. I can't believe there's no question, thoughts, or comment in here. Okay, maybe I'm just, I can't see the back of the room. There we go.
Hello, my name is Timothy Kiprono. I work for Open Governance Institute. I have 2 questions. I think the issue of linkage between taxes and services has been really, you know, a subject of discussion since yesterday. And I'm just struggling with that. How do we create that linkage? So, for example, you collect taxes from properties, and then because of competing interests, then you use that money to deliver or to respond to need in another sector. So you've collected rates, but you haven't done the sewerage. You haven't delivered water or the roads passing through properties. Are we suggesting that then we segment government revenues into specific categories and use whatever portion to respond to a need within particular section? The second one is still along those lines, is that when we collect tax from one source, still use the property rates in this case, but then respond to a need in another sector, then aren't we being unfair and promoting inequality in a sense? So how do we respond to that?
Since I think there was behind you, there was a question. Was there a question behind? No? Oh, it was oh, sorry, over there, that side. Do you have a mic?
Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Sylvia Ngini, and I work as an analyst. My question is directly to the panel, and this I would like to first of all appreciate him first of all for coming up and mentioning the finance bill that is actually being contested right now in Parliament. Our MPs are fighting. However, you have mentioned that in the previous years we've been having the bill being passed, and one of the main issues that we have as a country is that we have the political leaders who have very big chunks of land in Kenya. We have adapted capacity whereby these particular properties which are actually being held by the political leaders who are actually holding the big offices, they're the ones who are having the big chunks of land. So we've been having a trend whereby all these properties that needs to be published and the tax platforms need to be realized or need to be collected have not been done. And the country is continuously, year in, year out, crying out for these particular properties. So which are the current capabilities, or which are the current structures which have been put in place, which we can borrow from the developing countries, that is the other partners in the African continent, that we can be able to apply in Kenya locally and be able to completely fight this vice? Because as per what we are having right now, even if after this particular workshop we are done, a simple example is like the slum dwellers in Nairobi. We have a slum dwelling in Nairobi, the Kibera, the size of Soweto in South Africa, which currently carries almost 4 million people, but each person sits on a particular space of land, but we cannot be able to substantiate if this person pays taxes towards that particular property or not. So that question, I'll just direct it to
Thank
the
you very
panelists.
much. I think there was another question this side of the room. Was I missed? Oh, here, sorry, here in the front. The microphone's coming.
Good afternoon. Rich discussion. Thank you. My name is Damakrin from KRA, and my question goes to Dr. Rugo, a good friend. I'm sure he's already laughing because he knows the question. The struggle I have with a certain comment you made is when you look at Kenya, the levels of voluntary compliance are very low. I think we all agree. And it's not just a struggle that we have in this country, but in other developing countries, levels of voluntary compliance, extremely low. So yes, in as much as the tax administrators would want to take some time and apply all the measures that you talked about, at the end of the day, voluntary compliance is very low. And you wind the discussion that we had previously on enforcement. Unfortunately, the tax administration has had to focus more on enforcement vis-a-vis persuasion. I think that's the word used, vis-a-vis persuasion, again, because of low voluntary compliance levels. So my question would be to you again, and not just to Dr. Rugo, but the panelists. Having an understanding of the context of most developing countries and low-income countries, that the compliance levels are very low, voluntary compliance levels are very low. What then would you advise in terms of the political support? Not targeting the tax administrations and the local governments, the CECs and the revenue departments that are collecting. What else can be done other than targeting the collection? Because collection enforcement is always going to be at the very top, unfortunately, because of the kind of context we're in. So what other measures can be put in place instead of persuasion? What other strategies can you advise?
Thank you very much. But since you've probably already asked Dr. Rugo this question, you probably already know his answer. So I'm actually going to take your question, and I'm going to direct it to ABK, because actually that was part of their reform, was how to increase voluntary compliance. And I think part of this, the idea of this conference is to think outside the box and get ideas. So ABK, if you will take the voluntary compliance question. Colette, if you could take the question about the link, like how do you do this link in practice between revenues and services without creating sort of unfair pieces in the budget? And given you are only Kenyan on the panel, I'm going to pass the question of the finance bill and its actual implementation with regards to properties that are held hostage in some sense to you, Abraham, if that's okay. So ABK, do you want to start?
Thank you very much, Astrid, and thank you to the participants. As you rightly said, voluntary compliance is a major challenge, and it's a problem. What we tried to do in Freetown was, as I just described, was the participatory budgetary process, the initiative to see how we could link tax revenue to services being provided. And from the result, like I said, it's very encouraging, because in as much as the result on the compliance is not significant, but we see positive attitude towards government officials. And perhaps with time, the more trust the public has in the system, that could encourage voluntary compliance. Because for most of our countries, the major challenge have been people think that they are paying taxes basically for government officials to be used for their private purposes. So if we begin to see, and that could be also part of education, if taxpayers begin to see where their money is going, and like the results are suggesting, I think that will increase trust, and with more trust, there is the possibility that compliance will increase. So we'll continue to monitor that space, and hopefully maybe in the next couple of years or so, I will be good to see how that contributes to voluntary compliance. Thanks.
Thanks, ABK. So like a key part of your answer is like actually linking revenues to services, which is a lovely segue into Colette, which is how do you actually do this?
So thanks for your question. So I just want to again emphasize on the fact that when we think about local government, we also should start, and that's what you're doing, with recognition that yes, revenues are not enough. So yes, when we push for linking revenues with services, it's not an easy thing. That has to be done. So that's a fact. The other thing is that this has to be done eventually because of what the Macron said, compliance is low. So if nothing is done, nothing can work. And I think in my third question, I explained that in the context of a new reform, perhaps in my opinion, that's where government can then take that opportunity to change things. And one way to do that, not to say that you need, when you have a budget, to show that people in neighborhood A have paid this amount and this amount is serving to fund 5 roads in that neighborhood. Perhaps it can be to earmark a share of the revenues you are mobilizing for services. So in this case, it requires, first of all, willingness to do this earmarking. When you do that earmarking, there is also some thoughts around how much you can earmark. If a government probably has the ambition to earmark 90% of the revenues, this might not be realistic. So governments also need to do some exercise to really know how much realistically can be put aside for services, and once this is done, commit to use those revenues for services without stepping back. Otherwise, then it goes back to the issue of low trust. We have lots of cases where legislation sometimes pushes government to earmark a specific share of revenues for services. In the case of Kenya, county government should at least put aside 30% of own revenue sources for services. But when we analyze how this is going, we see that that 30%, yes, may be earmarked, but compliance will really be low. Only 10%, 20% will be used. I think the legislation in Kampala too encouraged local government to earmark a large share of revenue taxes, taxes from property taxes. And again, no compliance about it. So I think, yes, to answer your question, there is probably this strategy to try and do some earmarking, but not only that, but really ensure that there are some mechanisms that ensure that there is compliance in terms of using those earmarked revenues. And those mechanisms can be, for instance, putting in place some oversight committees that can really ensure that local authorities are complying with that. I think I can stop here for now, but I can expand on that later.
Thanks, Colette. Abraham.
Yeah, I think a key message that is coming from this conversation is that communicate. But secondly, do one thing and do it well. A big challenge is that with the push of citizens and not having conversations about the kind of services that can be expected, there is this desire to distribute the available money to everything. So you have little for everything, and then you never get anything done. So you still leave the road with potholes, you still leave the sewer system incomplete, you still leave bridges halfway done. At the end, you have a perception that these guys are doing nothing. I forget the example, but there's an example I know where they decided, let's just focus on at least getting the roads passable. You know, and that already starts to create, and as you communicate, you say, we are doing roads first, and you can see what we have done. Of course, you're not abandoning everything else, and I don't think you can have a budget conversation where you have abandoned everything else to only focus on access roads. So getting something done, I think, the idea of earmarking, I think it's interesting. But I would go more for start something and do it well. You know, you can, because if you start ring fencing little money for everything, you land in the same problem. You know, or again, you don't have enough. Because on that ring fencing, remember, it has to be done by law. It cannot just be at the prerogative of somebody. So when you pass it by law, then turning it around, and I know a county, especially where a team comes from, in Kenya that did a ring fencing for certain participatory budgeting kind of process, getting it back was completely difficult, you know, and then it meant that for the things that require, you know, bigger projects becomes very difficult. But she asked me a question, which I'm not too sure she wanted me to answer, on what to do with property and non-tax payment by people who also wield power. I don't think you again can run away from the conversation of rule of law in this and the enforcement of the same, because if you know, this is where the law, once the law is passed again, the law is supposed to apply to everyone, as it were. So we cannot run away from the conversation around enforcing the rule of law and their instruments and structures that have been put in place. And it's not only just a case here in Kenya, where you have large property owners who are not paying their rightful amounts of taxes. But I think the rule of law conversation again cannot be left out of the conversation as much as we said it's a political persuasion conversation. But allow me to say something on what Demakrin asked about voluntary compliance, because I say this really it's a deliberative, it's a democratic kind of a process. And compliance, all the studies I have seen, at least on compliance, have something to do with the end of the bargain being met. In other words, that the services are not only being provided, but there is proper communication. The focus on enforcement, on pushing, on hiring more officers to be able just to collect more and more and more and more without this other conversation. And then secondly, it cannot just be a tax administration problem to communicate. It has to also involve the other political players, the leaders within government, the executive, because often it's left to the tax department at the county level. It's left to the tax department at the national level, in this case, Kenya Revenue Authority. And finally, I wanted to clarify something on the finance bill. In Kenya, by law, even county governments publish their finance bills. And that is where all these rates, property rates, and all these levies are charged. I use the example of the national one because it has generated the greatest hit that has ever been there. And I think even as the Commissioner General said, there are also property rates that are charged by the national government in that sense. And how these are being connected, because revenue collection is not an end in and of itself. It's a means to something else. And that end is service delivery. Thanks.
Yeah. Even the gentleman who picked me up from the airport at 1 a.m. in the morning was debating on the finance bill, and I hadn't actually read the finance bill, so it was interesting. But I just wanted to add 2 quick points. One on the enforcement. From the panel we just had previously on enforcement, I think there is another area where enforcement can backfire is when you say you're going to enforce and then you can't enforce, and you lose a lot of credibility very quickly, right? And so that's, if you're going to actually go down the enforcement route, you need to have the tools and the capacity to do so, because people learn very quickly. I think the study we saw from Oyebola in Liberia, they said they were going to do it, and 1 year later they couldn't because they didn't have the capacity, and so then compliance went down again, right, because people learned quickly. The other thing on the linking practically services to budget, where I've seen some examples of participatory budgeting, the way the government has done it is they've literally put out for discussion or deliberation things they know they are going to invest in anyway, right? So you have 5 choices. As a public, you think you're being asked. Essentially, you're being asked your preference ranking between those choices, but the government knows they're going to do it anyway. And why do they do this? For the exact reason that Abraham said, is that they want to be able to show they are doing something and they've asked you. So there are ways that you can do it where you don't put everything out to debate, you don't earmark everything, you don't fragment your budget, but you start the conversation, which I think is what you're saying. We have time for another round of questions. We have one here, and a third one. One there. Perfect.
Hi, everyone. My name is Oyebola Okobe. I am a researcher at the World Bank's Research Department. My question is going to follow up on one of the points that Dr. Abraham made about how the reform is not for the tax authority to be championing alone, but it actually has to come from the executive. And I think the Freetown example was really a political leader that drove it. And so my question is, either from the specific instances you've worked on or just your general reflections, what are the factors that affect the emergence of this political will for reform? Is it mostly linked to like the economic conditions, political environment, individual personalities? What would you say are the most important ingredients that are needed for the emergence of these political leaders that will really drive reform?
Thank you, Jean-Claude from Cameroon. I want to bring out something that has not been discussed today, and that is concerning the link between compliance and services, especially for Francophone countries. In these countries, mostly the administration that is in charge of collecting the taxes is not the administration is charge of putting in place the services that are supposed to be evaluated. So from this aspect, from this view, it is difficult. It's not. I mean, what you have said doesn't really apply to this context. So I am putting out the subject to know what do you think about this particular for their particular case. What do you think about the link between services and compliance in this aspect? Thank you.
Hi, it's Paul Fish. ABK, I think in the comments about Freetown, I think you might have overlooked the communication effort that the reform effort made through Rosetta Wilson to set up the appeals desk. And the appeals desk was an incredible success in my view, where taxpayers were allowed to come to the office and make an appeal and an inquiry through that facility. So I think it might be worthwhile a comment from you on that.
Thank you very much. So Colette, I'm going to pass you as the person who's done most work in Francophone Africa on this question, what happens when the same agency is not responsible for both things? ABK, very clearly, could you speak more about the appeals desk? And Abraham, I'm going to pass you this question about what creates political will to come through. You have now a system in Kenya with a lot of different counties, a lot of different governors. I'm sure you've seen great ones and less so great ones, and so it'd be great to understand from your understanding what makes that happen. So maybe ABK, I'll start with you this time. Oh no, I started with you last time, right? Yeah. Okay, so Colette, you're still taking notes. Abraham, I'm going to start with you this time.
We need an investigation of how you choose your preferences. But having said that, I think, thanks for the question on political will. It's one, and first of all, a lot of the politicians we are talking about, or the people in office who are responsible for the overall service delivery here, we are talking about elected officials. So these are people who, after every 5 years, present themselves to the electorates. They go with a manifesto at the national government, the president, and of which the revenue authority is part of the, really part of the executive in that sense. And at the county level, again, you have the governor. I think one of the things you see is that, first of all, there is a clear commitment to leave a legacy. I think we cannot push that away from a desire to leave a legacy and make a difference, especially at the county level, because these are people who also live in those counties. And some of the governors we have seen make a big difference are people who really went in there because they wanted to make a change, with all the challenges that come with it. So there is that legacy, and the legacy basically is connected to their manifesto, the ones that they present to the electorate. But there's also a side of it about the political pressure from the citizens themselves, how well those actors are organized, both at community level, but also just through their civil society organizations, through their different forms of organizing and follow through, because again, that also makes a big difference. In a country like ours, again, you have almost a power differential in the sense that you also have certain spaces where authority is generally respected regardless. We can discuss that at length. So even when the leader is doing the wrong thing, is in authority, is respected. And then when you introduce even some religious convictions around it, it even just goes south sometimes. But yes, how citizens are organized, I think, makes a big difference, because then they are able to push and insist on the commitments being done. A bit of opposition politics seems also to play a role, and this is to do with the division within, the county assemblies, and that means the ability to hold the government and the governors to account. That is debatable in different ways, because, for instance, if I take an example of the governor of Makueni County, which I used, he literally did not do anything in his first term. The county was almost being dissolved because he had an opposition county assembly that basically was generally opposite. Literally, they couldn't pass any budget that he presented. They couldn't, so it ceased to be an oversight structure, but also just an obstruction, and nothing was moving. You know, thanks to elections, the whole lot was sent home, a new set was elected, and the next 5 years, basically a lot of difference was done. So for me, those are the things that we observe. Of course, we hope the checks of organizations like the kind of work we do of publishing, you know, transparency surveys that basically rank counties could create some pressure, but some care less about such things. But I think the first two are really critical: the need to leave a legacy and the political push by citizens, and you know, the eternal vigilance as will come with communities. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Colette, let me hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Jean-Claude, for this question. I'll try to be brief, but it's really a question that deserves at least an hour of discussion. So I think what you're saying in a context where you have central government authorities mobilizing revenues, basically being in charge of everything, and then transferring those revenues to local governments. So in this process, local governments are not involved, but they are the beneficiaries of those revenues, and they should be the one providing services. Now, I think what you're raising is an issue where maybe revenues mobilized are not enough to allow local governments to provide those services, but they have no control over what you can do at the central government level to try and improve things. I think it's a situation that we came across when we were doing research in Senegal, where we had the opportunity to interview municipalities and the central government, and there is a lot of frustration from municipalities, saying that central government has no incentives to change things, and because of that, compliance is low, we can't provide services, we are stuck. So what I could see that worked in Senegal was that the central government, with strong incentives and also strong political will, was able to put in place some kind of mechanisms to allow collaboration between the central government and local governments, so that local governments can be involved in that process. They can be involved in sensitizing citizens so that they can provide information to then be added to the property registry. Local governments will be involved also in revenue collection alongside central government agencies. And at the central government level, this strong political will also created a system of incentives where now the revenue authority should try and do better to then raise more revenues from property taxes because they receive something in return. So I think two key things here are collaboration, whether it's formal or informal. You know, the conditions can depend on the context and, you know, how legislation is done. The second thing is really incentives at both levels, so that at least by having that collaboration, by having incentives from those who hold the power to change things, then maybe they can be able to come up with a good strategy to increase those revenues, but perhaps a good strategy as well to increase tax compliance. But it's a really interesting case, and I think you need to learn more about the Francophone countries.
Yes, thank you very much for bringing up that question, because it is a key difference, as we were discussing yesterday, in how systems work. But I think that was a very good answer in terms of like the collaboration mechanisms being key and the incentive mechanisms. But ABK, Paul's right, actually, in many of the discussions, we haven't actually talked about what happens if citizens disagree with what they say, right? What's the mechanisms in there? So it'd be great to hear from your experience in Freetown.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thanks, Paul, for raising this. I mean, generally, the communication of it, I think this was not systematically studied, but I think we also introduced an appeals desk as part of the FCCA reform. And generally, I think that's really worked well, because for the first time, taxpayers have somewhere to go if you have a challenge. So they have an opportunity to lodge their complaints, and there's a system in place to even track what has gone wrong. And again, that will also be fixed as part of the system. And I believe, like I said, though not systematically studied, but I think that also contributes significantly to trust in the system. Because as has been mentioned, generally, trust in the system is a major challenge, especially from the public. Most times you see people refuse to pay because they just think that they don't believe in the system. So as a way to build the system, in fact, what we did in the case of Freetown, as part of the tax bill, that is an overview of how your tax was calculated. So on your own, you can even look at the tax bill and then just look at the model used, and you can compute what your rate is. If you are not very comfortable with that, you can pick it up with the appeals desk, you know, and like I said, a system is in place to see how those appeals could be addressed. And frankly, the first year, I don't have the numbers, but I think the appeals were the numbers were quite high, and that's really very, very encouraging. Yeah, sure. And it definitely shows engagement as well.
So that was an extremely rich panel. I'm going to try and probably fail to summarize the key highlights. I'm going to start with you, Abraham, because you've questioned my preferences and going first, so you're going to go first this time. I think also because you have, through this panel, provided the name for anyone who has a future property tax reform band. I suggest it be called Tax People and the Resistance Movement. So I think that one will always stick in our head. But in a more serious case, I think, you know, your message is loud and clear. We need to discuss, we need to deliberate, and we need to communicate, not just on the expenditures, but on the revenues too. And I think that fed extremely well into Colette's points, where communication is not only key in terms of how you interact with citizens, but for transparency and to ensure fairness of what the outcomes are. But also because there may not always actually be a weak link between services and revenue. It just may be a perceived weak link, which can be overcome through better communication. And communication, as we heard from ABK, was central to the very comprehensive property tax reform that was undertaken in Freetown. We also heard from ABK, and I can attest to this because we've worked together, reform is a full-time job. It takes time. But I think what we learned from ABK as well is like where you do reform well, where you do these pieces well, the communication, the appeals desk, all of this, citizens can actually be approving of an increase in taxes. And so I think all of that to summarize this conversation here to say taxes are really only as good as the services they provide. And I think that is the basis for reform. So please join me in thanking an incredible panel for that rich discussion.
Thank you very much, Astrid and the panel. That was really very interesting, very enjoyable, so much to learn from there. So without taking too much of your time, I know time is fast spent, I'm going to invite our Professor Will Pritchard, who's going to give us a summary of the conversations we've been having over the past couple of days. So Will, please come up. Please encourage him.
All right. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. All right. As Titila said, she's invited me, she and Colette have invited me to try to offer a bit of a summary of the deliberations over the past 2 days. Before I start, let me say two things. The first thing is I'm sorry you have to listen to me twice today, but I hope you'll forgive me. The second thing is I'm a little nervous because first I have to summarize some very rich discussions over the course of 2 whole days. And second, I'm taking the stage after a very impressive panel of people who spoke very eloquently about the issues we're covering. So I'll do my best not to disappoint as we move towards the end. What I'll try to do is capture, I think, the broad spirit of what we've discussed as best I can. And not more than about 10 or 12 minutes so we don't drag on. So the first thing that comes across to me when I think about what we've done over the past couple of days, and bearing in mind that some of us will still be here tomorrow for the technical workshops, but as we reflect over the 2 days of the main conference here, the big thing that comes across is there is an enormous interest and passion for trying to strengthen property tax systems across Africa, and I think also other parts of the world. I think that passion isn't just, of course, about raising more money.
It's very much about the ways in which raising property taxes can contribute to strengthening the finances of local governments, strengthening service delivery, and underpinning the stronger social contract we've just heard about. I think we've also heard, and this is important for all of us, that it's not just about raising money, it's also about raising money better, right? It's about raising revenue more equitably, more fairly, more progressively. And at the local government level, that's often, as we heard in the first day, about trying to replace what are often a fragmented set of small taxes that fall heavily on lower income people with more progressive and consistent taxes through property taxation. That way we try to move the tax burden towards those who have the greatest ability to pay. But we've heard, well, there's this enormous passion, this is enormous potential for property taxes. The reality on the ground is that many of these reform programs are still very much at an early stage. Revenue raising almost everywhere, I think, in the room, still falls far below the potential that's out there. Property taxes remain, by some distance, the most underperforming of the major tax types that exist in virtually all low-income countries. Right? In some ways, that's a daunting message, right? It tells us about how far we have to go, but it's also an exciting message, because it tells us about how much potential there is in the discussions we're having here. Aside from the low revenue generation, I think we've also heard a lot about the broader inequities that characterize property tax systems and the sources of those inequities. Right? When we think about property tax systems, they don't affect everyone equally. Right? We've heard that loud and clear. That reflects sometimes incomplete property registers. Some people are registered and some are not. It reflects unfair valuations. Some people are asked to pay a lot, while others, often those with the greatest ability to pay, are not asked to pay as much as they perhaps should be. And it also relates to ineffectiveness in tax administration, which holds back the ability to ensure that everyone's paying what they should. Those inequalities, as we've heard, and this is where ABK just ended, don't just undermine revenues and fairness, they also undermine public trust in the system. Right? And in that, they undermine also the broader social contract. I think a critical message that arises from the conference, and it came across in this discussion just now about Anglophone versus Francophone countries, is that while the challenges are common, explanations for poor performance and the challenges that countries confront have commonalities but are also very diverse and different across locations. When we think about solutions, we need to be able to think about those differences and tailor what solutions look like to those different contexts. And it's been wonderful to have a group here that's reflected that diversity of experiences. When we think about the challenges that countries confront, some of them are broadly technical and legal, right? They're for the technocrats in some sense, as we've just talked about. It might be about overly burdensome, restrictive, or problematic policy frameworks, often at national level, not local level. It might be about the technical challenges of administration. How can you identify properties? How do you register them? We've heard a lot about the challenges of digitalization, the technical challenges of finding the right system, of finding the right provider, of managing change in administration. And sometimes those challenges are about complex institutional arrangements. How can ministries of finance work with ministries of land, work with local governments, and so on? And so the different sessions have captured these technical challenges. But we've also heard clearly, again, mostly in this last panel, that the challenges are also fundamentally political. I had a conversation last night with Mustafa. I don't know if he's back there somewhere. Mustafa from Nigeria. And he said, maybe we all need to think of ourselves as being politicians, not just technocrats, because these are political problems, and we need to grapple also with the political challenges of reform. And so we've asked ourselves here, and I think it's great we've asked ourselves these questions. You know, what kinds of measures can be put in place to build confidence among taxpayers in the tax systems being developed so that they will support reform, so that they will comply, and so on, right? How do we better link revenues to services? How do we put in place participatory budgeting, and on down the line? We also have asked, how do you persuade politicians that raising property taxes is a good idea? Right? We know most of our politicians are scared of the idea of supporting more property tax because they fear the backlash. But we also know from experience, and we've heard these experiences, that if you have a fair system, a trusted system, a system that contributes to services, these systems can be politically popular. And so how do we build that case going forward? And likewise, how do we engage administrators themselves, right? In this room, we have a lot of committed administrators who want to see these systems work better. But we also know that change management can be hard. when you digitalize, when you bring in new systems, how do you make sure that everyone's on board to move those processes forward? And that diversity of challenges then creates the need for diverse sets of solutions and ideas to solve them. But while I've talked about challenges so far, I think the bigger message of the conference, and what we've tried to convey with some of the speakers, is that while the challenges are many, there are lots of good reasons for optimism. Right? At a broad level, we know that collecting property taxes should be significantly easier in many ways than collecting things like personal income taxes. Properties are visible, they're immovable, they're right there in front of you. In principle, they're easy to identify and they're easy to tax. But more importantly, we saw in this conference significant evidence that those things are possible, whether it was from Kampala or from Freetown or from Benin, from Togo, from other places. We've seen these stories of success and what's possible. And a lot of that success, I think, has revolved around the strategic deployment of technology, but tailored with well-thought-out plans and strategies that are tailored to the capacities and institutional realities of the countries where everyone is working. And all of those successes have been accompanied by strategies to build public support to ensure sustainability. So while all the challenges are distinct, we've seen components of what success looks like. And hopefully some of those things can also travel. Because we see those signs of optimism, I hope that we all come away from the conference, I certainly do, with the sense that this is a wonderful area to be working in. It's an area where we know there's enormous potential for improved outcomes, but there's also enormous need because of the gap between what's possible and where we often are now, but also because we have this knowledge that significant improvements are possible. There's a part of me, and look, maybe it's the optimist, but I think others share this view, that we're at this moment perhaps, in part thanks to interesting technological innovations, where there's the potential for these systems to get much stronger and quickly. We've seen in the room lots of people who are doing interesting work to transform how these systems function. And I think it's exciting to feel that we're sort of in the midst of that expansion of these new ideas. So against the background then of these challenges, I think a lot of what we've heard in this meeting has been about new initiatives, success stories, and new possibilities. I won't capture all of those, but let me try to capture a few strands of those discussions that I think we've seen running through the conference. One of those has been about recent innovations and successes revolving around the simplification of property identification and property valuation to make them more complete. While the details of these initiatives vary across countries, many of them are unified, I think, by the sense of adopting simplified approaches that strategically leverage technology in order to build systems that are comprehensive, relatively easy and low cost to administer, and that build trust among taxpayers. We've seen examples of using GIS technologies to quickly map properties, examples of using simplified valuation methodologies to create fairer, more comprehensive valuation. I think another set of questions that's come out clearly is around this question of enforcement, the debate we just had on stage beside us. Because we all want to believe that voluntary compliance is enough. But we also know that sometimes enforcement is a necessary part of getting people to pay. Right? Any government you talk to, and in fact, almost every government official that's been on this stage has said a version of this, it is extraordinarily hard to get people to pay their taxes under any circumstances. And so while we need voluntary compliance, we also need strategies for trying to get people into the net. And those problems, of course, are particularly acute, as we heard here yesterday, when the taxpayer is your central government and they don't want to come and pay. So there's no silver bullet here, but I think the sharing of experience has felt powerful. We've seen interesting examples of strategies that governments have used to try to strengthen enforcement. They've ranged from persuasion to legal threats to more aggressive strategies like locking buildings or limiting access to service or taxpayer clearance certificates and so on. But I think as I walked around the room, it felt like everyone was sort of listening to these experiences from elsewhere to think about how it could be done more effectively. But critically, we've also seen here as well evidence that those measures can work. Right? For those in the enforcement section, we saw evidence from John, from Oyobola, who are conveniently sitting together, about the ways in which new enforcement initiatives could be successful in increasing compliance as well. But while we've talked about enforcement, we've talked much more about this question of voluntary compliance. I won't rehash a lot of what we've heard so far, other than to say we've heard a simple message. Right? Taxpayers are more likely to pay their taxes, but also to politically support those who push reform if they believe that systems are fair, that they get things in return, and that they have a voice in shaping what happens next. Right? And the importance of those measures, to take us to the heart of the matter, is not limited to the question of encouraging compliance. Right? There's always a risk when you're in a group of tax experts that we only talk about how to raise more revenue. But we were lucky in the first day that we really got to the heart of the matter here, which is that all this discussion of revenue raising, of compliance, is fundamentally about then ultimately providing improved services to citizens. Because I think Astrid mentioned at the end, greater revenue raising is only useful if it's translated into benefits. Otherwise, it's not clear what we're all doing here in the first place. And so it was exciting to think about how that happens in practice. And I think one thing we've heard in that discussion, this is a group here of activists, of researchers, and of tax administrations. But we see that taxpayers and tax administrations actually have incentives that in many ways are very closely aligned. Right? When tax administrations can work with their governments to provide more benefits to citizens, citizens make the job of tax administrators much easier because they become more willing to pay. And so keeping our eye on that dynamic is so critical to all that we're trying to do. I think it also reminds us of something deeper and why the work that we're doing here is exciting. We've heard a lot of people mention this idea of the social contract, and it's good to circle back to that. Right? In some sense, we talk for any tax about the idea that when governments raise revenue, citizens want to get something in return, and that forms a social contract. It's important for all tax types. It seems particularly important for property taxes, and again, I think we saw this week. Because for property taxes, unlike other taxes, that relationship feels very immediate. Right? If you're a property owner, you get a bill, it's right in front of you, you need to pay it. And in turn, you're looking to your government to provide a service that you can touch and feel in front of you. Right? That's really exciting because it means that if governments do that well, it can be transformative. It can build this greater sense of social contract between citizens and their governments. But it also reminds us, if governments don't do that well, it can do the opposite. Right? It can undermine the trust that citizens have in their governments and what they're seeking to deliver. So I'm getting the signals about time, but I'm on time. I could say more because there's been so much more that everyone said in this conference. An enormous number of things, and that puts aside all the wonderful discussions I'm sure have happened in the hallways as well, and all the discussions still to come. But I think to conclude, I just wanted to say a little bit more about my broader sense of the conference, and why it is that the conference is so exciting in a broader sense. Because I think what's most exciting about all of this, and I get the sense that this is a shared view, is the best part of what's happened here is we've been able to bring together an enormous wealth of experience, of insight, of enthusiasm, and a shared interest in a shared set of challenges. The goal of an event like this is never just to have one group of people stand up here and talk at everyone else. Right? The goal is to bring together a group of people who can share ideas, search together for new solutions, and collaborate in those efforts. And I think that's what we've seen here. And for that, on behalf of our team, I'd just like to say I think we're all enormously grateful that all of you decided to spend time here with all of us, sharing in these discussions, deliberations, and search for solutions. These kinds of opportunities for mutual learning have been very rare, I think, in the property tax field. For other tax types, they're quite common. For property taxes, they're quite rare. And so I think on behalf of all of us, I hope that everyone else has enjoyed as much, at least as I have, the chance to exchange ideas as we've gone, but also that we leave with the sense that this is the part of a broader conversation amongst a group of experts who are working towards the same challenges, looking for the same kinds of solutions to move us forward. So I'll end there as a summary. I hope a useful and faithful summary of some of the key things we've described, the broader spirit of the conference, and I'll pass back to Titi Lola.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Will. So we're now at that moment, I think. Before I go to the concluding remarks, I just want to ask you all to please stay after the concluding remarks. We're going to have a conference picture taken in here, so please don't rush off and leave. Please stay for the photograph. Also to say there's loads of material outside from the ICTD for you to pick up as you're going, so please do stop by the desk, pick up the materials. You'll find them useful. So, it's been 2 days of learning, talking, and connecting. I hope everyone has had as tremendous a time as I have. Without wanting to go over everything that Will said, I wanted to say that there have been a few really, highlights for me. So, for example, the governor of Kisii, during the opening plenary, Governor Arati speaking with such candor about the challenges of property taxation with such openness and honesty. I found that really refreshing. Will Pritchard, in the second plenary, talking about the fact that innovative solutions are not necessarily synonymous with high-tech solution. Sometimes what works best is what's tailored to the context in which you're working. I think that should stick with us. Robert Nowere, I really enjoyed listening to Robert during his plenary, where he was talking about Kampala City and how proactive engagement with citizens and convincing explanations given by the Kampala City Council was able to successfully introduce simplified valuation methods at a fraction of the cost that their previous method using expert valuers was cost. I think it was from about $11 million to about $1 million. Fantastic, results there. I enjoyed listening to Morfal, although, it was a video, but I did enjoy listening to him and where he highlighted the need for a strong change management function when we're doing reform. Reform means people have to change the way they do things. Nobody likes things to be done to them. They like to be part of that change process. And unless we have that strong function managing the change, perhaps reforms could be a little more difficult than they need to be. And I think the panel this afternoon, sort of reiterated a lot of that engagement, communication about what's happening to people, usually gets them on board. So a lot of things, insights shared, which I believe will have been thought-provoking as we listen, each of us drawing parallels to our home situations, and I hope will have sparked the beginning of conversations that will ultimately gather momentum as we return home and deliver much-needed improvements in revenue generation and service delivery to citizens. So, for me, maybe I'm biased, but I think the quality of discussion has been astounding. Thank you so much to our partners, IBEC and KESRA, who have been phenomenal in guiding and supporting us in our planning and ultimately the success of this conference. Thank you, IBEC and KESRA. Could you just please give them a round of applause? I also wanted to thank the event planners who've organized everything. Many people have come up to me to say this is well organized, so Wairidi, thank you. Our thanks also goes to the interpreters. So this conference has been very rich because we've been able to bring together both Anglophone and Francophone experiences into one room. Without our interpreters, we could not have been able to understand each other, so thank you. Thank you very much. I wanted to thank Serena Hotel. Hasn't the facility been great? I think so. So thank you, Serena Hotel, for having us and for supporting us through everything. Our speakers, our moderators, your expert knowledge and experiences, it was just really so evident throughout every single session. So I wanted to say a big thank you to all of you for coming and for sharing. Thank you so very much. A round of applause for the speakers, all speakers and moderators. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. All our participants, so even if you were not a speaker or a moderator, you participated one way or another in all those conversations that animated tea breaks and lunch breaks and dinners. And I just wanted to say thank you. For those of you who joined us online, thank you so very much for being part of this conference. We're really grateful that you made the time to be here and to join into this conversation. Finally, I wish to thank the LoGRI team. Wow. In particular, the planning team who have been working for months tirelessly to make this possible. Moyo, are you here? Well, I don't know, maybe he's outside still working. I wanted to say a big thank you to Moyo. Priyanka, are you here, Priyanka? Thank you, Priyanka. Priyanka has been phenomenal. Marie-Reine, who's not even here. Colette, Reagan, Megan, all of you who have worked so tirelessly to make this the success that it is, thank you. I also wanted to thank Camille, who was managing the interpreters, Nick, Evan, Priya, everyone within the LoGRI team who have worked so hard to bring this conference to life and to make it a success. Thank you, LoGRI team. And without much further keeping you, I wanted to say a big farewell to all of you. Please let the conversations continue beyond here. Let's continue talking and safe journey back to your various destinations. Thank you.